What is the mind doing right now? As you lie here in the dark, not what you wish it were doing. Not what you have been telling yourself it should do by now. What is it actually doing? In this moment, in this room, behind these closed eyes? Maybe it is still moving through the rooms of today, picking things up and putting them down. Maybe it is rehearsing tomorrow, laying out its arguments, organizing its worries into neat rows. Maybe it has been at this for an hour already, and a quieter part of you is just tired. Tired of the sound of your own thinking. Tired of the weight of your own attention. The Dhammapada has 8 doors. Tonight, we open them slowly, one by one. This is an ancient text, composed in the Pali language, spoken verse by the Buddha himself, in response to real moments in real lives. People who were confused, or grieving, or afraid. People who could not sleep for reasons that would sound familiar to you tonight. For 2,500 years it has been copied by hand in monasteries across Asia, memorized by monks in Sri Lanka and Thailand and Japan and Korea. Recited in the cold before dawn as a kind of medicine for the wandering mind. I came to these verses during a period when my own mind would not leave me alone at night. There is one verse I will share with you near the end of this journey that I have kept close ever since. But we will arrive there together, slowly. If you feel moved to leave something in the comments tonight, leave just one word. Whatever is in your chest right now, whatever brought you here, one word is enough. No explanation needed. Tonight we will travel across 8 traditions, 8 centuries, 8 lives, all of them pointing in their different ways toward the same quiet truth the Dhammapada has been offering since before any of our grandparents were born. We will sit with a Japanese master who taught thousands of ordinary people that the mind they were so frightened of was already free. We will walk with a Vietnamese poet-monk in the mountains of the Tran dynasty, and with a Tibetan scholar who had to lose everything he knew before he could find what he was looking for. We will visit Cambodia and Korea and ancient China and the high passes of Bhutan. All of them heard these teachings, or teachings like them, and all of them found their way through the same door. These stories are contemplative in nature, not medical or therapeutic advice. Please do not drive or operate machinery while listening. Now let your body do what it already knows how to do. Let the mattress receive your weight. Let your hands open slightly, as if setting something down. You do not have to follow every word tonight. You do not have to understand everything or remember anything. If you drift off before the 2nd story or the 5th, that is not failure. That is the whole point. The only thing asked of you right now is this: let the 1st door open. The verse the Dhammapada opens with is not a command. It is an observation, offered the way a kind person might offer something to someone who has been searching for it in the wrong place. Manupubhagama Dhamma. Mind is the forerunner of all things. Mind leads. Mind shapes. What the mind has already decided. The body and the voice and the day will follow, as the wheel of the cart follows the foot of the ox. Most people, hearing this for the first time, feel something tighten in their chest. If the mind leads everything, they think, then I need to fix my mind. I need to control my thoughts. I need to stop thinking the things I keep thinking and start thinking better thoughts. And so the effort begins. The effort to supervise and correct and improve, the very organ doing the supervising and correcting and improving. And within about 4 minutes it becomes clear that this is not going to work. Bangkei Yotaku understood this completely. And for this reason, his teaching was something quite different from what most people expected when they came to hear a Zen master speak. He was born in 1622 in Harima province, in the western part of what is now Hyogo Prefecture, the third son of a Confucian scholar and physician who died when Bangkei was 10. The family was not poor, but the loss of the father meant the older brothers took charge, and Bangkei, the youngest among them, who survived childhood, found himself increasingly strange to his own household. He had a mind that would not settle into the shapes it was given. At 11, he was asked to copy and recite the Confucian texts that all schoolboys were required to memorize. There was a phrase in those texts, a phrase about something called bright virtue, and Bangkei could not let it go. What was this brightness? Where did it live? He asked his teachers, and they gave him definitions. And the definitions satisfied everyone around him except Bangkei himself, who wanted to know not the words for the thing but the thing itself. His family found this consuming engagement with an unanswerable question difficult to live with. At 11 years old, he was sent away. He built himself a small hut in the nearby hills, propped a handwritten sign at the entrance, reading, "Practice Hermitage," and settled in to find what he was looking for. He would not find it quickly. For the next 14 years, Bangkei traveled and searched, and sat in meditation with a ferocity that damaged his body. He wandered through Kyoto and Osaka and Kyushu, sleeping in open fields, scrounging for food, staying at temples when they would receive him, and sleeping in the wilderness when they would not. He sat zazen for so many hours that his legs ached for days at a time. He restricted his sleep, his food, his movement, his contact with other human beings, all in the hope that deprivation would crack something open and let the bright virtue he was seeking finally show itself. By the time he was 24, he had contracted tuberculosis. A doctor who examined him said plainly that he would die. Bangkei did not argue. He had pushed so hard for so long that there was nothing left to push with, and so he let go, not as a spiritual practice, but as a simple fact of his body's condition. He lay in his small dwelling, unable to sit, unable to practice in any formal sense. He had no more effort available to him. The walls of his hut were thin cedar, darkened with smoke from a small charcoal brazier that barely kept the autumn chill at a distance. The sound of wind in the pines outside was constant, a sound that had once felt like an interruption and now felt, in his exhaustion, like company. His breath was shallow. His chest ached with each movement, and in that state of complete surrender, watching a mass of dark phlegm slide down the wall beside him, something resolved itself so quietly and completely that he did not even have a dramatic story to tell about it afterward. "All things," he said later, "are perfectly resolved in the unborn." He did not mean that suffering disappears or that the mind goes quiet. He meant something much simpler than that, and much more difficult to argue with. The mind that you are trying to fix, the one that races and worries and replays and rehearses, is not the mind you actually are. Beneath all of its movements, something is already awake, already recognizing, already at rest. You were born with it intact. You have never not had it. The frantic mind is something that happens in front of it, the way weather happens in front of the sky, and the sky is never harmed by the weather. He called this the unborn Buddha mind. And after his recovery, after all the years of confirmation and wandering and further practice, this is what he spent the rest of his life telling people, in the simplest language he could find, to anyone who would listen. He was unlike any Zen master of his era. He did not use koans. He did not teach in the aristocratic formal style that most masters of his time employed. He opened his lectures to farmers and merchants and women and children, and he spoke in the common dialect of the region, in ordinary language, about the most ordinary thing he had found, that the mind everyone was so frightened of was already, at its root, free. Some of his lectures drew tens of thousands of people. They came in their working clothes, in the smell of the fields, with their children half asleep on their shoulders. He did not make them feel small for this. He told them they had brought everything they needed. This is the story of one evening in 1673, near the town of Himeji. He was 51 that year, and the abbot of Ryomonji, the temple he had founded in Harima province, the province where he was born. The temple was simple by design, wooden buildings arranged around a courtyard where a single pine grew from cracked stone, its roots finding water by paths no one had mapped. Bankei had chosen this temple partly because of that pine, he sometimes said. A tree that found its way without instruction, a tree that did not need to understand the underground to drink from it. That evening the meditation hall was crowded in a way that made the wooden walls creak. The autumn harvest had just ended, and farmers from 3 villages had come in their field clothes, smelling of rice chaff and turned earth and wood smoke, sitting with their knees against their neighbors' knees on the polished wood floor. There were merchants from the castle town and a few samurai who had not announced themselves but whose posture gave them away. There were mothers who had walked 2 hours carrying infants who had fallen asleep against their shoulders. There were monks who had been practicing formally for decades and young novices who had been practicing for weeks. There was a potter whose hands were perpetually stained grey with clay. There was an old woman whose husband had died the previous winter, who had not been able to stop crying at unexpected moments, in the market, while feeding her chickens, while folding laundry, and who had come tonight because she was tired of herself. Among them was a man named Toshiro. He was 43 years old, a dyer of cloth in the city of Himeji, and he had come because a neighbor had told him that this monk spoke differently, without riddles, without the cold formality that made Toshiro feel like understanding was something reserved for people better than himself. Toshiro's mind had been, for the past 6 months, in a state he could not name precisely, but recognized in his body as a kind of permanent tightening. A fist made of worry that sat just below his sternum from the moment he woke until the moment exhaustion finally took him at night. His wife had been ill all spring, a fever that had broken but left her thin and slow to regain herself. His eldest son had failed at his apprenticeship with a fabric merchant in Osaka and returned home without explanation, saying little, eating at the family table with the look of someone who was ashamed of the air he was taking up. The bills for the dye shop had grown past what the season's work could cover, and the neighbor who usually shared the cost of the indigo had found a cheaper supplier elsewhere. At night, lying on his sleeping mat with his wife, breathing quietly beside him, Toshiro's mind would produce the same thoughts in the same order with the same results, going nowhere, resolving nothing, simply circling. He had tried to correct this through stronger discipline. He rose earlier. He worked harder. He told himself that weakness of mind was the problem and sternness was the cure. He prayed at the household altar. He did not find any of it sufficient. Bankei entered the hall without ceremony. He was not tall, and he walked with the slight deliberateness of a man whose body had been through something it remembered. He sat. He looked out at the crowd with the particular quality of attention that those who knew him recognized immediately. Not the distant gaze of a master performing transcendence, but something much more immediate, as if he were genuinely interested in each face in front of him and had enough room inside himself to be. He began to speak. "What are you all doing here tonight?" he said. And he did not mean this as a koan or a challenge. He meant it as a real question, warmly asked. "You walked all this way. Some of you. You left your fires and your sleeping children. Something brought you here." A few people laughed, not at anything, but at the relief of being spoken to directly. "What is it that brought you?" he continued. "Most of you, if you answer honestly, are carrying something that your mind will not put down. A worry, a grief, a face that keeps appearing, a fear about money or about someone you love. You have heard that Buddhist practice is about training the mind, and you have come hoping I will give you the technique, the tool, the discipline, so that the mind will finally obey." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the pine in the courtyard made a small sound in the wind. "I will tell you something that may disappoint you at first," he said. "The mind that keeps giving you trouble is not your true mind. It is the unborn Buddha mind turned against itself. The way a hand, if you clench it long enough, begins to ache. You cannot fix this mind with the same mind that is doing the worrying. That is like trying to wash blood off with blood. What you are looking for," he said, "is what is already here, right now, in this room, recognizing my voice without effort, without deciding to understand, without any training at all. That recognition is the unborn. That knowing, before thought, before commentary, that is what you already are. That is what you have never not been. You cannot hear a crow and mistake it for a sparrow," he said. "You cannot hear a child's voice and think it is an old man's. That instant knowing, before language arrives to name it, that is Buddha mind. And it is perfectly awake right now, in every one of you, whether you have practiced for 30 years or never sat a single hour of zazen in your life." Toshiro, sitting in the third row with his knees against those of a farmer he did not know, felt something inside him go very still. He was not sure what had happened. The words were simple. He had heard versions of them before, in temple sermons that used them as preamble to more complicated instruction that he could not follow. But something about the way Bankei said them, without implication that they were meant for anyone other than whoever was sitting there, made them land in a place below thinking. He felt them in his body rather than in his thoughts, somewhere below the tightening, in a place he did not know he still had access to. He became aware, in that moment, of his own breathing, not as something to control, just as something already happening. His chest rose and fell. The hall smelled of pine and candle wax, and the faint earthiness of so many bodies close together in the autumn cool. The candle nearest him cast a small moving shadow across the floor. He was aware of all of it at once, effortlessly, without choosing to be aware. And the tightening, for a moment, was not there. After the talk, Toshiro did not approach Bankei with a formal question. As the monks were doing, he simply sat in the now nearly empty hall until the candles burned low. He was not meditating in any technique he had been taught. He was just sitting. The old woman who had been crying at unexpected moments sat near him, also not leaving, and neither of them said anything. And the silence between two strangers who have heard the same thing and felt it in the same way is its own kind of medicine. He walked home in the dark. The night insects were loud in the rice fields. His feet knew the path without his needing to think about it. The unborn. He found himself thinking, not as a concept but as a recognition, like seeing a tree you have always walked past, and suddenly actually seeing it. His feet knew the path. That knowing, before thought, was already there. He would still lie awake sometimes in the weeks that followed. The wife was slow to regain her strength. The son still said little at the table. The bills did not disappear. But Toshiro found, with a frequency that surprised him, that he could watch his own worry from a small distance, the way you might watch smoke rising from a neighbor's chimney without being inside the fire. The thought would arise, and he could notice it arising. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, he could feel that there was something behind the noticing that the thought could not touch. This is what Bankei was pointing toward. Not the elimination of the restless mind, but the recognition that the restless mind is not all you are. The first verse of the Dhammapada says mind is the forerunner. Mind leads. And it is true. But Bankei spent 70 years of his life trying to show people that the mind they kept trying to improve and discipline and quiet was not their deepest mind. Beneath the wheel that turns and turns, something is still. Beneath the thought that follows, the thought that follows the thought. Something is simply aware. You have been aware all day. You have been aware through the worry and the planning and the grief and the small indignities of being alive in the world. You did not have to try to be aware. You did not earn it. It was simply here, the whole time, the way the sky is simply here, on the other side of every cloud you have ever watched. Think for a moment about how your body arrived at this position tonight. How your hands found the position they are in without your needing to instruct them. How your breath is happening right now without any act of will on your part. Something is already caring for you, below the level of your decisions, below the level of your worry. It has been doing this your entire life. That is close to what Bankei meant. That prior knowing, that already here, awareness. Not something to achieve, but something to recognize. Let your shoulders release a little more. Feel the place where your body meets the surface beneath you. You do not need to hold yourself up. The surface is doing that already. The breath is doing that already. What Toshiro found in that hall, in the stillness that arrived before he could manufacture it, is what the first verse of the Dhammapada has been pointing toward across 25 centuries. Not a technique, a recognition. The verse has two faces. The way a mountain seen from the east and the mountain seen from the west look like two different mountains. The first face is the warning. If the mind leads in bitterness, suffering follows. The second face is the gift. If the mind rests in its own nature, What follows is what the verse calls happiness. The word the tradition uses not for pleasure, but for something steadier. The quality of ease that comes not from circumstances going well, but from the ground beneath circumstances settling. Bankei spent those 14 years of grueling practice trying to build something. And what he found, at the moment he stopped trying, was that the unborn was always there. It was waiting in the thin-walled hut in the mountains, while he made himself sick with effort. It was in every moment of recognition he had already had. The crow he knew was a crow before he named it. The mother's voice he knew was his mother's, before he processed why. All of that ordinary knowing, taken for granted, was the Buddha mind itself, already functioning, already whole, requiring nothing. There is something in most of us that finds this difficult to receive. We have been taught, in 100 different ways, that what we need must be earned, that rest must be deserved, that the quietness we feel in rare moments of grace is a reward for something we did correctly, and therefore fragile, and therefore likely to be taken away. But Bankei's teaching moves in the opposite direction. The quietness is not the reward. The quietness is what you already are. The noise is what happens on top of it. The wheel turns and turns above the still lake. The lake does not turn. Right now, in this darkness, in this body, there is something that has been awake all evening without effort. Something that registered every sound and sensation as you settled here, that tracked the shift in temperature as your body warmed the space around it, that is still registering the weight of the blanket and the sound of your own breath, gently, without making a problem of any of it. That is enough. That is the unborn. That is what the Dhammapada means when it says, mind leads. Not the worried, planning mind, the knowing mind, the one that is already here. Let it lead you now, into the dark, into the rest that is always available beneath the thinking. You do not need to do anything else tonight. Let the breath slow without trying to slow it. Let the hands be open on the surface where they rest. The unborn has been here the whole time, and it will be here when you wake, and it will be here in the middle of every difficult day that still has to be lived. Nothing to resolve, nothing to hold on to, just this awareness, noticing itself, already at rest. The second door waits, as gently as a candle waiting for you to look at it. Somewhere tonight, in a mountain province of northern Vietnam, there is a pagoda on a hillside surrounded by pine trees that do not lose their color in winter. The stone path leading up to it is worn smooth by centuries of feet. In the garden behind the main hall, a plum tree grows near an old well. In winter, before any leaves appear, before any other tree in the mountain garden has stirred from the cold, the plum sends out its blossoms from bare, dark wood, white and small and without ceremony, as if winter were simply not a reason to wait. Let that image settle in you for a moment. The cold hillside, the bare branches, the small white flowers that arrive before they are expected, that ask nothing, that offer everything they have and no more. There is a verse in the 4th chapter of the Dhammapada that has always read, to me, less like a warning and more like a love letter written to the distracted mind. Death carries off a man who is gathering flowers and whose mind is distracted, as a flood carries off a sleeping village. The flowers are not evil. The verse never says the flowers are evil. They are beautiful. They are the very reason the man has walked so far from his home. The color and the scent and the way each one seems more worth stopping for than the last. The danger is not the flowers. The danger is the scattering. The mind that follows each blossom until it has forgotten entirely where it began, what it was looking for, what village it came from, what it meant to return to. Huyen Kwang knew this verse from the inside. He was born in 1254 in Van Thai village, in the province of Bac Giang in northern Vietnam. The son of a family of modest means who recognized early that their child had a mind built for something larger than the village. He was taught to read the Chinese classics, then the Buddhist texts, then the philosophical literature of the court, and he moved through each of them the way a person moves through rooms they were made for. By the time he was 20, he had passed the Trang Nguyen examination, the highest imperial examination in the land, achieving the top rank among all the scholars of the Tran dynasty court. This was not a small thing. The Trang Nguyen was the pinnacle of the Confucian examination system, the culmination of years of study, so demanding that most men who sat for it failed many times before passing, or never passed at all. To achieve the top rank was to be lifted into the highest circles of the court, to be given appointment, to be given the name of a man whose future was assured. He was appointed to the Imperial House Institute. He became ambassador to China, crossing the sea in formal robes to represent the Tran dynasty in the courts of the Yuan. He was gathering very beautiful flowers. The court of the Tran dynasty in the late 13th century was not a quiet place. The Mongol invasions had only recently been repelled, twice, and then a third time. And the country that emerged from those 3 wars was a country that had found something out about itself, a capacity for endurance, a pride that ran deeper than any single emperor's reign. The capital, at Thang Long, what is now Hanoi, hummed with that energy. Poets wrote, officials debated. The king himself, Tran Nhan Tong, was a man of unusual depth, a warrior king who had led his armies against the Mongols on horseback and who meditated before sunrise and who, even then, was beginning to understand that the throne he occupied was itself a kind of distraction. Huyen Kwang moved through this world with distinction. He spoke the court Chinese required for diplomacy, wrote poetry in the classical form, managed the intricate relationships of official life. He had everything that a man of his background and generation was supposed to want. His name was known. His future was bright. Each flower he stopped for was more extraordinary than the last. And then, sometime in his middle years, he looked up. The sources do not record a single moment of turning. What they record is a gradual shift, a growing restlessness with the ceremonies and the appointments and the vast machinery of prestige, and a growing attention to the monks he encountered, particularly to Phap Loa, the second patriarch of the Truk Lam school, through whom he was eventually drawn into the orbit of the school's founder, the abdicated Emperor Tran Nhan Tong himself, who had left his throne to live as a monk on the mountain of Yentu. What the king-turned-monk had understood, and what he transmitted to Huyen Kwang, was precisely the thing the flowers chapter was pointing toward. The flowers are real. The beauty is real. The life of the court, the life of scholarship, the life of accomplishment, none of these are false. But the mind that chases them without knowing it is chasing. The mind that moves from flower to flower without ever arriving at rest. That mind is already lost before it knows it is lost. The flood comes not with warning. Huyen Kwang was ordained at Vinh Niem Temple in 1305. He was 51 years old. He spent the following decades traveling with the Truklam teachers, studying, teaching, moving between the mountain monasteries that the school had established across the northern highlands. He walked trails between peaks that were cold even in summer, eating the simple food of monastic life, sleeping in small cells that smelled of pine and old ink. He wrote poems. He wrote many poems. The poems are what survive most clearly, copied and recopied across the centuries, because they do something that doctrine cannot quite do. They let you feel what it was like to inhabit a mind that had stopped chasing, a mind that could look at a winter plum blossom and find it entirely sufficient. This is the story of one winter at Konson Pagoda, in the mountains of Chi Lin. In the final years of Huyen Kwang's life, he was in his late 70s by then, which meant he had been a monk for more than 25 years, which meant he had been a scholar and official for 25 years before that, which meant that the man who sat in the small stone pagoda on the slope of Konson Mountain had lived long enough to hold both lives inside him and know the difference between them. Konson in winter was a particular kind of quiet. The mountain pine trees did not lose their needles, and so the hillside stayed dark green even through the coldest months. But the undergrowth died back, and the air sharpened, and the world contracted to the sounds that cold amplifies, the creak of a branch, the cry of a bird far down the valley, the occasional small avalanche of snow falling from a laden branch onto the stone path below. The monastery garden smelled of wet pine and cold earth and, faintly, of the incense that drifted through the main hall's open doors. He rose before light, as he always had. The cell he occupied was small, the sleeping mat worn smooth by years of use, the single oil lamp burning low by the time the sky outside the paper screen window began to lighten from black to a deep grey blue. He washed his face in water so cold it made the bones of his hands ache. He sat. His mind was different now than the mind that had learned the Chinese classics by lamplight in Bakjiang, or the mind that had written careful diplomatic memoranda in the imperial chancery, or the mind that had stood before the Yuan court in Hangzhou making arguments in perfect formal Chinese. It was not quieter. Exactly. The same thoughts moved through it. Observations about the weather, about the needs of the monks in his charge, about the state of a manuscript he had been revising, about the cold. But they moved through it differently now, the way the wind moves through an open hand rather than a closed one. They arrived and departed without leaving the hand changed. He had a young monk in his charge that winter, a novice of 19 named Min Duk, who had come to Konson from a village near the Red River Delta, and who had been practicing for only 8 months. Min Duk was earnest in the way that novices are earnest when they first arrive, burning with intention, sitting with the rigid back and tightly closed eyes of a person who believes that if he tries hard enough, something will crack open and pour its meaning into him. One morning, after the dawn chanting, Huyen Kwang found the young monk in the garden behind the pagoda, kneeling in front of the winter plum tree that had just begun to show its first blossoms. These were the first flowers of the year, small and white, appearing before any leaf, pushing up directly from the bare, dark wood of the branches in the way that plum blossoms always do. as if cold was simply not a sufficient reason to delay. The air around them carried the faintest sweetness. Almost not there, almost just imagination. Minduk was staring at them with the particular intensity of someone who is trying very hard to have a spiritual experience. "What are you doing?" Huyen Kuang asked. The young monk startled. "I am looking at the flowers," he said. "I thought, perhaps if I contemplated them correctly, I might understand impermanence or emptiness. I have been here for half an hour." Huyen Kuang looked at the blossoms. Then he looked at the young monk. Then he sat down on the cold stone bench nearby, with the deliberateness of a man whose knees remind him of their history each time he bends them. "You are trying to understand the flowers," he said. "Yes, venerable teacher. And what have they told you in half an hour?" The young monk hesitated. "Nothing," he said. "Or perhaps everything. I cannot tell the difference." Huyen Kuang was quiet for a moment. A bird called somewhere in the pine trees above them. The white blossoms moved very slightly in the mountain air, releasing their faint sweetness and then withholding it again, as if the fragrance were itself practicing impermanence. "The verse from the Dhammapada," he said finally, "does not say the flowers are the problem. It says the distracted mind is the problem. The man who gathers flowers and whose mind is scattered, that is the one death carries away. But the verse also speaks of the bee who moves through the flowers without harming them, without taking their color or their fragrance, only gathering what it needs. The bee is not afraid of the flowers. The bee does not try to extract enlightenment from them. The bee simply moves, and the nectar comes, and the flower is left whole." Minduk looked at him. "So I should not contemplate the flowers?" "I did not say that. I said you should not try to extract something from them that they are not offering. You are approaching these blossoms like a court official approaching a problem, with an agenda, with a desired outcome. But the flowers have no agenda. They bloom in winter because that is what plum flowers do, not because they have decided to teach you something. They are not holding meaning inside themselves, waiting for the right scholar to unlock it." The young monk was quiet. "When I was young," Huyen Kuang said, "I was very good at extracting meaning from things. I was trained for it. The examinations reward exactly this skill, the ability to take a classical text and extract its essence and arrange that essence correctly on a page. I was better at this than almost anyone in the empire. And for many years, I believed that this same skill applied everywhere, that if I looked hard enough at anything, I could extract what was most valuable from it and move on." He looked at the plum blossoms. "It took me a long time to understand that some things do not want to be extracted from. Some things offer themselves only to the person who is willing to be present without taking. The plum tree in winter is one of these things. The breath is another. And the quiet that comes at the end of a long day, when the mind finally stops its gathering, that is perhaps the most important of all." Minduk was still looking at the white flowers. After a long moment he said, quietly, "They are very beautiful." "Yes," said Huyen Kuang. "They are. And that is all?" "That is not a small thing." They sat together in the cold garden for a while longer. The pagoda bell rang in the distance, calling the monks to morning work. Huyen Kuang rose slowly and placed a hand briefly on the young monk's shoulder. "When you come back to these blossoms tomorrow," he said, "come back the way the bee comes, not to extract something, not to solve something, just to be with them for a moment. Take what is freely offered and move on without clutching. The flower that is not clutched at stays whole, and so does the mind that does not clutch. He walked back toward the pagoda. The pine trees above him sighed in a small wind. Below, somewhere in the valley, the winter river was moving through its stones. That evening, Hu Yen Kwang sat by his lamp and wrote a poem in the classical form. The poem was about winter plum blossoms, about the way they appeared from bare wood without announcement, about the cold that made them possible, about the bird perched in the branches who was simply a bird, simply there, not carrying the weight of meaning. He wrote it in a single sitting, the brush moving without hesitation, and when he was done, he read it once and set it aside. He did not know that the poem would be copied by monks at Konsan for 200 years after his death. That young novices arriving at the pagoda would be given it to memorize in their first year, not as doctrine, but as instruction in a particular quality of attention. The quality that Dhammapada was pointing toward when it spoke of the bee who moves through the garden without harming a single petal. He died at Konsan in 1334. At the age of 80, the plum tree in the garden bloomed the following winter without being asked. What Min Duke found in the winter garden that morning is worth sitting with in the dark tonight. He had come to the flowers trying to accomplish something. This is the shape of the distracted mind the Dhammapada is describing, not the mind that is lazy or indifferent, but the mind that is too purposeful, the mind that cannot encounter beauty without immediately turning it into a project. Extract the wisdom from it. Have the experience correctly so that it can be counted as progress. Arrive at rest through effort. The verse calls this gathering flowers with a distracted mind. And the distraction is not what we usually mean by distraction. It is something more precise, the inability to be fully with what is here, because the mind is always already reaching for the next thing, always already beyond the present flower, always already composing the story of the experience rather than simply having it. Most of us know this pattern from the inside. We lie awake at night not because we have been idle, but because we have been too busy gathering, reaching, accumulating the day's experiences without ever stopping to simply receive them. The day becomes a kind of debt, things seen but not truly looked at, beauty noticed but not absorbed, kindnesses given and received without the moment to feel them land. The mind went through the whole day like a man going through a flower garden with his hands full, picking up each new flower before he has put down the last, until by evening he cannot even remember what the first one smelled like. Huyen Kwang spent 30 years at court learning to gather. He was exceptionally good at it, and he spent the next 30 years learning to stop, not to become empty or passive, but to arrive, to let the thing in front of him be fully in front of him before moving toward the next thing. He did not lose his intelligence or his discernment. He still wrote poems, still taught, still managed the needs of a community. But the quality of his engagement changed. The hand became open. The wind could move through it. This is what the bee knows that the flower gatherer does not. The bee does not try to take more than the flower is offering. It does not grip the flower closed or carry the whole plant home. It takes what is freely given, the nectar already present and ready, and it moves on. And the flower is left so completely whole that it could not tell you whether the bee had visited or not. Your mind tonight has access to this same quality. The day is already what it was. The flowers have already bloomed and already closed. There is nothing more to gather from them. What is left now is simpler than gathering. It is the returning, the coming home to the breath, the settling of the bee back into its own stillness at the end of a long day of flight. Feel the weight of the blanket. Feel the surface beneath you, how it holds without asking anything. This is the flower receiving the bee. This is the night receiving you, without demand, without requirement. Simply here, let the breath complete itself and rest there for a moment before the next one begins. There is space between breaths, the way there is space between flowers in a winter garden. You do not need to fill it. You do not need to gather anything from it. Let the breath be what it is, freely given, freely released. The flower left whole each time. If sleep comes now, let it come. You do not need to stay awake to receive what is already being offered. The third door opens further along the mountain, where someone who lived 15 centuries ago learned that the stillness at the center of a life outlasts all its wandering. The pine trees on the slope of Kon Son are still standing. The plum tree, or one very much like it, still blooms each winter without being asked. The well in the garden still holds its water, clear and cold, patient as stone. That patience is available to you tonight. It has always been available. You do not have to gather it. It is simply here. The island of Sri Lanka in the 5th century smelled of rain. Not the brief, polite rain of temperate climates, but the monsoon kind. The rain that arrives with the weight of an ocean behind it and does not apologize for how long it stays. The air at Anuradhapura held moisture even between storms. A warm heaviness that made the stone dagobas gleam and the fig trees grow enormous, and the lotus pools on the monastery grounds fill and overflow and fill again. At night, the frogs announce themselves from every direction. The stars, when the clouds allowed them, were low and bright and tropical, as different from the stars of northern India as a different language. Into this world, sometime in the first decades of the 5th century, a scholar arrived from the mainland. He had traveled by sea, a passage of several days. His manuscripts wrapped in oiled cloth against the salt air. He was not young, exactly, but not old. He had the scholar's particular kind of body, slightly forward-leaning, as if perpetually bending toward a page, with hands that moved when he thought, even when there was nothing to move them toward. His robe was the saffron of the northern monasteries, slightly faded from the sea journey, and his sandals left prints in the red laterite mud of the path from the port. His name meant Voice of the Buddha. Buddhaghosa had been born in the kingdom of Magadha, near the place where the Buddha himself had once sat under a fig tree and refused to rise until something had broken open inside him. He had been raised in the Brahmin tradition, which meant years of Sanskrit texts, the Vedas memorized in childhood until they lived in the body like breathing, the intricate philosophical arguments of the Sanskrit schools, mapped and known and argued over and known again. He was exceptional at this. He might have spent his life as a Brahmin scholar, doing what Brahmin scholars did, adding new arguments to old arguments in a tradition that had been doing exactly that for 1,000 years. And then a monk named Rivata crossed his path, and the arguments stopped, and a different kind of study began. What the monk said, or how he said it, is not recorded with precision. What is recorded is that Buddhaghosa was converted, ordained, and set to work on the Buddhist texts with the same ferocious completeness that had served him in the Brahmin tradition. He read everything in the north. When he had read everything in the north, he was told that the oldest and most complete commentaries were in Sri Lanka, in Sinhala, at the great monastery of Mahavihara in the ancient city of Anuradhapura, and that no one in India had access to them because no one had translated them into Pali. He took a boat. The crossing took several days. He spent most of it on the deck, watching the sea, composing the arguments he would need to make when he arrived, the demonstrations of his scholarship that would persuade the elders of the Mahavihara to give him access to their manuscripts. He had been told they were cautious with scholars from the mainland. The commentaries they held were old, some of them going back 4 centuries. And they were protective of them the way a family is protective of the letters of their great-grandparents, knowing that once something old is handled carelessly, it cannot be made old again. The Mahavihara in the 5th century was, by most accounts, the most sophisticated center of learning in southern or eastern Asia. The Chinese monk Faxian, who had visited a few years before Buddhaghosa arrived, recorded that it housed 3,000 monks. Not students. Monks, which meant people who had given their entire lives to this work, who rose before dawn and chanted and meditated and studied and debated and copied and taught, generation after generation, in a place that had been doing this for more than 600 years. The stone paths between the buildings were worn smooth not by centuries of feet but by millennia of them. The bathing pool at the monastery's western edge had steps of granite that descended to the water in perfect geometric precision. Cool, even in the tropical heat. The water still and olive green. Buddhaghosa was given a cell. He was given access to the manuscripts. He was given, after he had demonstrated what he could do, the enormous task of taking everything the Mahavihara's monks had accumulated across 6 centuries of commentary and translating it, systematizing it, rendering it into the Pali that scholars across the Buddhist world could read. He began with what would become the Visuddhimagga, the path of purification, his attempt to map the entire Buddhist path of practice in a single coherent work. It was during this period, in the 3rd year of his residence at the Mahavihara, that he encountered the young novice Kassapa. Kassapa had come from a village 2 days' journey to the south. He was 16, the son of a rice farmer who had given him to the monastery at age 12, because the family had more children than land, and because the abbot who had visited their village had recognized something in the boy's eyes. He had been practicing for 4 years by the time Buddhaghosa arrived, which meant he knew the morning and evening chants, knew how to sweep a meditation hall without making noise, knew how to hold a begging bowl, knew the rules for walking in the rain and sitting at meals and speaking to seniors. He did not know how to sleep. Not precisely. He could fall asleep. He could sleep for an hour or 2 before the mind took over, before the churning began, the questions running in a loop that was so familiar, he could have recited it in the order it arrived, whether he had understood the teaching from this morning's discourse, whether the senior monk who had looked at him during chanting had been displeased with him, whether he would ever understand the texts the way the scholars understood them, whether he would spend his whole life here and still not arrive anywhere. By the time the first bell rang before dawn, he had usually been awake for 2 or 3 hours, his mat damp with the heat, The frogs outside his window working without pause. He had tried what the older monks suggested. He had tried counting breaths, which worked for 17 breaths, and then the mind slipped past it. He had tried reciting the precepts, which turned into thinking about whether he was observing the precepts correctly. He had tried imagining the Buddha sitting peacefully in the moonlight, which turned into wondering whether his visualization of the Buddha was doctrinally accurate. The mind was, it seemed, relentlessly creative in its capacity to turn any remedy into another problem. He knew the verse, "Long is the night to the sleepless." He had memorized it at age 12 with all the other verses, reciting it without difficulty in the morning chanting. Not yet knowing that it was a description of his own life, he approached Buddha Kosa one afternoon in the manuscript room, where the scholar sat, surrounded by palm leaf manuscripts, many of them held open with small stones. The light from the latticed window falling in slats across the pages. The room smelled of old palm leaf and ink and the particular dusty sweetness of manuscripts that have been handled by many hands over many decades. A gecko on the upper wall was absolutely still, watching. Kassapa had been rehearsing what he would say for 3 days. He had composed the questions several different ways and rejected each version as either too casual or too formal, too specific or too vague. The habit of the questioning mind, as it turned out, extended even to questions about the questioning mind. He had noticed this irony and found it unhelpful. Buddha Kosa looked up. Kassapa asked his question directly, as he had been taught to ask questions. He said, "The Buddha spoke a verse I do not understand. Long is the night to the sleepless. Long is the league to the weary. I know these words. I have memorized them. But they do not help me. The night is long to me whether I understand the verse or not. What is the verse actually teaching?" Buddha Kosa set down his stylus. He looked at the novice for a long moment, and then he did something that surprised Kassapa. He laughed. Not unkindly. The laugh of a man recognizing something he knows well. "You are the verse," he said. Kassapa looked at him. The Buddha did not write that verse to explain something to people who are sleeping peacefully. Buddha Kosa said. He wrote it as a mirror, to hold up in front of someone who already knows the long night from the inside. Someone for whom the hours between the last bell and the first bell stretch out like a road that does not end. The verse is not a teaching about sleeplessness. It is a recognition of it. The Buddha is saying, "I see you. The night is long. I know." Kassapa was quiet for a moment. "And the second part?" he asked. "Long is worldly existence to fools who know not the sublime truth?" Buddha Kosa considered this. He picked up one of the palm leaf manuscripts, handling it with the automatic care of someone who had spent years touching things that could not be replaced. "The word the verse uses," he said, "is bala, fool." It sounds harsh to us because we hear it as a judgment. But look at what the verse is actually saying. The fool is not the wicked person. The fool is simply the person who does not yet know what is causing the suffering. The weary traveler is not a bad person. The sleepless monk is not a bad monk. But the one who does not know why the road feels endless, who does not recognize the pattern of the mind that creates the length, that one will keep walking the same road without arriving anywhere. He set the manuscript down. "When you lie awake tonight," Buddha Kosa said, "notice the quality of the wakefulness, not the thoughts themselves. but the structure underneath them, the loop they move in. The way one question arrives, and before it has been answered, it generates the next question, and that question generates the next. Can you feel the structure of it? Kassapa said he thought he could. That structure, Buddhaghosa said, is what the verse is pointing toward. Not the thoughts, but the pattern the thoughts are running in. The wheel turning in the dark. The traveler who is tired but will not stop, because stopping feels like giving up. Once you can see the pattern as a pattern, something changes. Not immediately, not completely, but the night becomes a different kind of long. It becomes the kind of long you can rest inside of rather than fight. He returned to his manuscripts. But Kassapa did not leave immediately. He stood for a moment at the edge of the room, in the latticed light, and felt something shift very slightly in the way he was carrying the night. Not gone, not resolved, but named. He bowed and left, and walked back through the stone-paved courtyard where the lotus pool held its green water without agitation, and the fig tree at the monastery's edge was doing its ancient, patient work of simply being a fig tree. That night, Kassapa lay on his mat, and when the mind began its familiar loop, he did what Buddhaghosa had suggested. He did not try to answer the questions. He looked instead at the wheel. He could feel it. When he looked that way, something underneath the individual thoughts, a kind of turning energy, the mind, not resting but circling, like a wheel on a cart, going nowhere in particular, turning, turning. The sound of it, familiar enough that he had stopped noticing it was a wheel. He watched it for a while. The question about whether he had understood the morning's discourse arrived. He watched it arrive. He noticed it was a question. He noticed the quality of urgency it carried, the way it positioned itself as requiring immediate resolution. He noticed that it had been arriving at approximately this time every night for years without ever being resolved, and that this failure of resolution had not prevented the sun from rising or the monastery from continuing its work. He did not stop the wheel, but watching it from even a small distance changed the quality of the watching. The frogs outside were still calling. The rain that had started after the evening meal was still tapping against the palm thatch roof with a sound both irregular and inevitable. The heat was still there, but the night was not quite as long as it had been, and the difference was not in the night's actual length, but in the quality of his relationship to it. He was lying inside it rather than fighting it. He was, for the first time in months, almost a passenger in his own sleeplessness rather than its prisoner. Buddhaghosa completed the Visuddhimagga in the years that followed, the great work that would anchor Theravada meditation practice for 15 centuries and more. He then wrote commentaries on all the major texts of the Pali Canon, including the commentary on the Dhammapada itself, the Dhammapada Atthakatha, which preserved the original stories behind each verse, including the story of the woman who lay awake all night grieving her daughter, to whom the Buddha offered the verse on the long night, saying, "I know, the night is long, and here is what makes it longer than it has to be." He returned to India when his work was complete. The manuscripts he had made stayed in Sri Lanka. They traveled, eventually, to Burma and Thailand and Cambodia and Laos, carrying the long, patient work of a scholar who had come from far away and found, in an island monastery in the monsoon rain, the words that had been waiting for him, What Kassapa found in the latticed light of the manuscript room is the same thing the verse has been offering for 25 centuries. A recognition, not a solution. Not a technique for preventing sleeplessness or making the night shorter than it is. A recognition. And recognition, it turns out, is not nothing. Recognition is often the thing that changes without announcing itself as change. Long is the night to the sleepless. The verse does not say, "Here is how to stop being sleepless." It says, "I see you." And in that seeing, something changes. Because much of what makes the long night genuinely long is the feeling that it should not be happening, that something is wrong with us for being awake, that others are asleep and we are not, and this gap is evidence of something broken. The verse closes that gap. It says this has always been happening. There have always been people lying awake in the dark. The Buddha knew their faces. He saw them in the villages and the monasteries. He knew the structure of what they were doing, the wheel turning in the dark, the questions generating questions, the traveler too exhausted to stop walking. The second insight the verse is offering is equally quiet. The word that gets translated as worldly existence is samsara, and samsara is not a place. It is a quality of movement. The wheel turning, the going that does not arrive, the mind returning to the same thoughts in the same order and finding them no more resolved than the last time it visited them. Samsara is long not because existence is painful, but because the mind does not know how to stop spinning. And the verse's gift is not to stop the spinning, but to show the spinner that the spinning is spinning, to name the pattern so that the pattern can no longer pass as the whole of reality. Notice, right now, whether there is any of this quality in your mind. The circling, the same ground revisited, the question that does not resolve but generates the next one. The replay of a conversation from earlier in the day that has been played back so many times now that it has stopped containing information and is simply a groove the mind knows how to fall into. You do not have to fix it. Buddha did not tell Kassapa to fix the wheel. He told him to see it, to recognize the structure, because the mind that sees its own pattern has already, in that seeing, created a small distance between itself and the pattern, and that distance is enough, not to end the night, but to change its quality, not to stop the road, but to let the traveler sit down for a moment on the grass beside it. Think about the difference between being inside a wheel and watching a wheel. When you are inside the wheel, the turning feels like forward motion. It feels like progress, like something might resolve if you just stay with it long enough. But a wheel turns and returns to the same position. Forward motion is not what it is designed for. The wheel that Kassapa was lying inside every night was not taking him anywhere. It was only exhausting him. What Buddha gave him was not a new wheel, or a way to stop the wheel, but the ability to step back far enough to see its shape, to recognize, this is a wheel. This is what it does. I do not have to confuse its motion for progress. Tonight, in the dark, if the mind is circling, you can offer it this same small mercy. Not the demand that it stop, not the judgment that it should not be doing what it is doing, just the quiet act of recognition. I see you. This is the pattern. The night is long. I know. And somewhere beneath the wheel, something older and more patient than the wheel is simply here, waiting for you to notice it has been here all along. Let your jaw release a little. Let the weight of your head be entirely held by whatever is beneath it. Let the feet relax. The toes uncurl from whatever they have been holding. There is nothing the mind needs to solve in the next few minutes. The wheel can turn if it needs to. You do not have to turn with it. You can lie still inside the night the way the lotus pool lies still inside the monsoon, receiving what arrives without being swept away by it. The fourth door opens at the edge of a different kind of darkness. In a monastery in 14th century Korea, where a monk named Naeong was learning that the biggest obstacle to wisdom is thinking you already have it. But that is a story for a few breaths from now. For the moment, simply rest. The night is long, and you are already, without effort, lying inside it. The mountains of central Korea in late autumn carry a particular quality of stillness. The oak trees have released their leaves. The paths between temples are carpeted in brown and amber, and the cold comes not gradually but all at once, as if the mountain had made a decision. At night, the stars above the ridge are very bright, the sky having shed the haze of summer, and the silence between the temple bells is the kind of silence that makes you aware of your own heartbeat. In the autumn of 1340, a young man of 20 was sitting with his closest friend when the friend's breathing changed. He had been ill for 2 weeks. The illness had moved through the stages that illnesses move through in that era. The fever, the delirium, the brief rallying that made everyone hope, and then the final deepening. The young man, whose name was not yet Naeong, whose name was still the birth name his family had given him in the province of Yeongdeok, sat with his friend through that final night and watched what happened when a person's breathing stopped. He did not know what to do with what he had witnessed. He went the next morning to the elders of his village, the men who knew things, the men who had lived long enough to have seen this before. He asked them a simple question: where do people go when they die? And not one of them could answer him. They offered him reassurances, traditions, the kinds of words people use when they mean well and know nothing. But none of them could tell him where his friend had gone. He was 20 years old, and the most important question he had ever asked had received no answer. And this felt to him not like grief, exactly, but like a door that had opened onto a room he had not known existed. A room that his entire life, up to this point, had carefully avoided. He went to the mountain. Mount Gongdoksan was a day's journey from his village, and there was a hermitage there, and a monk named Yoyon, who had the reputation of a man who did not offer comfortable nonsense. Naeong presented himself and asked to be ordained, and Yoyon shaved his head and gave him a different name and told him that the question he was carrying was not an obstacle to practice. It was the practice. For the next several years, he walked the circuit of Korea's monasteries. He traveled on foot, carrying almost nothing, sleeping in the guest quarters of whatever monastery would receive him, and moving on when he felt there was nothing more to learn there. The country he walked through was the Goryeo dynasty at the complicated end of its long decline. A civilization that had survived Mongol invasion and political upheaval and several centuries of Buddhist institutional prosperity that had slowly, in the way that prosperity corrodes things it touches, produced a Buddhist establishment, rich in ritual and poor in sincerity. The monasteries he visited ranged from austere mountain hermitages, where elderly monks sat for 16 hours a day, to elaborate lowland complexes where the incense was expensive and the ceremonies were magnificent, and the actual quality of the practice was difficult to locate. He met monks who had been sitting for 40 years and whose eyes had the particular transparency of water that has been still for a very long time. He met monks who had been sitting for 40 years and were simply angry about it. He met a monk in the south who had, after 3 decades of formal practice, sold most of his robes and gone back to farming, and who said over a simple meal that he had learned more about presence from planting rice than from any text he had ever read. Naong sat with all of them. He learned from both kinds, though in different ways. The Goryeo Buddhist establishment that surrounded him was not without genuine teachers, but the institutional corruption was real and visible. Monks acquiring land and wealth and political influence that the original tradition had specifically warned against. Naong was not naive about this, but he also understood, in the way that someone who has been asking a real question for several years begins to understand things, that the corruption of an institution does not invalidate the practice at the heart of the institution, any more than a cracked pot invalidates water. He was practicing Huadu, the particular Seon method of attending to an unanswerable question, a question chosen not for its content, but for its capacity to generate what the tradition called great doubt, the kind of questioning that swallows the questioner until the questioner and the question are no longer separate things. His Huadu was not a formal one. It was still the question from that morning at the bedside, expanded and clarified by years of sitting, not where do people go when they die. Exactly, but the deeper form of the same question, what is this that watches? What is the nature of the awareness that sits in this body and sees, before the breath, before the name, before the accumulated story of 27 years of being this particular person, in this particular province of this particular century? What is already here? He arrived at Hoamsa, a monastery in the hills of Yangju north of what is now Seoul, sometime in the mid-1340s, and it was there that something finally cracked open. The monastery sat on a hillside among oak and chestnut trees. In autumn, which is when Naong arrived, the leaves had turned and were falling in slow spirals into the courtyard, and the air was the particular clear cold of Korean autumn that has no equivalent in more temperate climates, sharp enough to make the inside of the nose ache, carrying the smell of fallen leaves and distant chimney smoke and the cold mineral clarity of mountain water. The meditation hall was unheated. The floor was stone. The practitioners sat wrapped in their robes in the particular stillness of people who have learned that the cold is not a problem if you stop arguing with it. The Huadu had been with him so long that he no longer experienced it as a question separate from himself. It was more like a quality of pressure, a sustained ache behind the sternum that was always there, regardless of what else was happening. Present during meals, present during walking meditation, present in the brief hours of sleep, present now as he sat on the stone floor of Hoamsa's unheated meditation hall in the cold Korean autumn, with the sound of wind in the chestnut trees outside, and the smell of incense and cold stone, and the faint dampness of corundation, recently laundered robes. He had been sitting in that hall for several days when, during one ordinary morning of practice, the question he had been living inside for 7 years simply dissolved. Not answered. Dissolved. The distinction between the watcher and the watched, between the questioner and the question, between Naong and the autumn morning, opened and became nothing, and then closed again. And he was sitting on the stone floor with tears on his face and the sound of a leaf landing in the courtyard outside reaching him with the absolute clarity of something heard for the first time. This is the story not of that moment, but of what came after it. Because what came after it is the part the verse in the Dhammapada is actually pointing toward. In the months following his awakening, Naong was known among the other monks at Hoam Sa as someone whose presence had changed. The abbot confirmed his experience as genuine. His questions in the teaching sessions had a different quality, less effortful, more direct, as if he had stopped translating and started speaking. Younger monks came to sit near him, not because he said much, but because silence near him felt different than silence near other people. And then a young monk named Seongjin arrived at Hoam Sa. Seongjin was 23, recently ordained, educated at one of the great scholarly monasteries near the capital, where the curriculum was extensive and the library was the finest in the country. He had studied the major sutras. He had read the commentaries. He had memorized long passages of doctrine and could recite the lineages of the major schools and explain the key distinctions between them with precision. He was articulate and quick, and he knew he was articulate and quick. And this knowing sat on him the way armor sits on someone who has not yet realized they are not in a battle. He had come to Hoam Sa because he had heard that a monk there had recently been confirmed as having attained genuine awakening, and he wanted to test this. This is worth pausing on. He wanted to test it, not to learn from it, not to receive it, to verify it against his own criteria, which were the criteria of his learning, which were themselves products of the maps he had been building for the past 3 years. He did not know that this was what he was doing. He thought he was doing something else, being careful, being discerning, being the kind of serious practitioner who does not accept claims without evidence. But the armor is always invisible to the person wearing it. He approached Naong during the afternoon work period, when the monks were clearing fallen branches from the monastery paths. Naong was carrying an armful of branches toward the woodpile, moving without hurry, his attention apparently on nothing in particular, and therefore on everything. "I have a question for the Venerable," Seongjin said. Naong set down his branches. "I have studied the 3 vehicles extensively," Seongjin said. "I understand the doctrine of emptiness as presented in the Prajnaparamita literature, and I have read Nagarjuna's Mula Madhyama Kakarika and can explain the key arguments. I have worked through the Heart Sutra commentaries and understand the relationship between form and emptiness as the tradition defines it. Given all of this, what should I be practicing now?" Naong looked at him for a moment. The afternoon light was coming through the chestnut trees at an angle that made the falling leaves appear briefly golden before they landed on the stone path. "Do you know?" Naong said. "What you don't know?" Seongjin paused. He had expected a different kind of question. This one seemed, on its surface, too simple. "I am aware of the limits of my understanding," he said. "That is why I am here." Naong shook his head. Gently, "That is not what I asked. You have just told me the extent of what you know. You have described your understanding of emptiness, your reading of Nagarjuna, your familiarity with the commentaries. You have mapped the territory of your knowledge with considerable detail. But I asked about what you don't know, not the named gaps in your learning, the thing that is prior to any map at all." Seongjin did not answer immediately. He was accustomed to answering quickly. Speed of response was something he had been praised for throughout his years of study, the ability to locate the right framework instantly, to supply the relevant sutra passage, to position the question correctly within the existing body of understanding. Silence felt, to him, like failure. He stood in it for a moment, with the discomfort of a person in an unfamiliar room looking for furniture that is not there. The Dhammapada says, Naong continued, that a fool who knows his foolishness is wise, at least to that extent. Most people hear this verse and feel reassured. It seems to be saying that awareness of limitation is already a kind of progress. And it is. But the verse is also saying something harder. It is saying that the most dangerous kind of foolishness is not the foolishness of the person who knows nothing. That person is already in the right relationship to learning. The most dangerous foolishness belongs to the person who has learned so much that they have stopped noticing what they cannot see. He picked up another branch. You have spent years building a map. Naong said. The map is accurate in many ways. The map is genuinely useful. But somewhere along the way, the map became the territory. You began navigating by the map so consistently that you stopped noticing the actual ground beneath your feet. And the actual ground is the only place where anything real ever happens. What should I practice? Songjin asked again, less certainly this time. Naong smiled, not unkindly. Start from not knowing, he said. Not as a technique, as the truth. You do not know what is looking through your eyes right now. You do not know what it is that hears my voice. You do not know, if you are honest, what happened in the mind that chose to walk here and ask this question. Go sit with that not knowing, not as a deficiency to be corrected, as the most honest thing you have. He carried the branches to the woodpile and walked back toward the meditation hall. Seongjin stood for a moment among the falling chestnut leaves. He had come with a question he already knew the shape of. He was leaving with something formless, something that felt uncomfortably like the beginning of a real question, rather than the refinement of questions he had already answered. This was not what he had expected. It was, he thought, standing in the slant afternoon light, possibly what he had needed. That evening, Songjin sat in the meditation hall and tried to approach his practice the way Naong had suggested. Not with the map. He found, to his discomfort, that without the map he did not know what to do. The map had been so present for so long that its absence felt like blindness. He sat with that. It was not comfortable, but it was honest. And he was beginning to understand that honesty was where the practice actually started. He became one of Naong's students for the next 3 years. He never stopped being scholarly, but he learned, slowly, to hold his scholarship the way you hold something in an open hand, rather than a closed fist. He learned to let what he knew be useful, without letting it become the whole of what was possible. The Dhammapada's 6th chapter turns on a single hinge. The fool who knows his foolishness is wise, at least to that extent. The verse appears simple, but it contains a teaching that every serious practitioner eventually encounters from the inside. The place where accumulated understanding becomes the very thing that prevents further understanding. The scholar who can explain enlightenment cannot find the entrance. The monk who has memorized every verse about the tasting of soup cannot taste the soup. This is not a criticism of learning. Naong spent his own next years traveling to Yuan, China, studying with masters of the Linji lineage, receiving transmission, deepening his understanding in every formal way available to him. He was never anti-intellectual. What he was insisting on, in that afternoon conversation in the leaf-strewn courtyard. It was the difference between a map and the territory the map is trying to describe. And most of us, if we are honest, carry maps we have mistaken for territory. Think of the maps most of us carry about sleep. The story that says I am someone who cannot sleep well, or I am someone whose mind does not stop, or I need this many hours, or I cannot function. These maps were assembled from real experience, the actual nights of wakefulness, the real mornings of exhaustion. They are not invented, but the map, once drawn, begins to predict the territory rather than describe it. The mind arrives at night already holding the story of what is about to happen, and the story shapes what happens. The expectation is its own kind of pressure. Right now, in the dark, the mind may be navigating by maps of itself, patterns of self-knowledge that were accurate once and have since become the thing that limits further seeing. Ideas about what kind of person you are, what you are capable of, what your mind does when left alone, whether you are the kind of person who sleeps easily or does not, whether you are productive or scattered, worthy or insufficient. These maps feel like facts. They feel like self-knowledge, and they may be much older than the actual territory they claim to describe. The verse is not asking you to discard what you know. It is asking you to notice the moment when knowing becomes a wall. The moment when the map says, "This is all there is to see here." Let the hands open a little on the surface where they rest. Let the jaw be less certain. There is something in this body, in this dark room, that none of your accumulated self-knowledge quite reaches, that precedes every story you have ever told about yourself. That was here before the first idea you ever formed about what kind of person you were. That something does not require your confidence in it. It does not require your understanding of it. It was here before you knew how to think about it, and it will be here after thinking has rested for the night. That something is very quiet. It does not announce itself. It simply remains underneath every map, in the actual territory. The territory that Naong found in the meditation hall in Hoam Sa that autumn morning, when the question dissolved and the leaf landed in the courtyard with the sound of something arriving for the first time. The fool who knows his foolishness. The fool who knows his foolishness. The fool who knows his foolishness is wise, at least to that extent. Not because foolishness is wisdom, but because the willingness to not know, to hold the map loosely, to arrive at the territory as if for the first time, is itself the beginning of every real seeing. You do not need to arrive anywhere tonight. You only need to let the map be a little lighter. The territory is already here. Your body knows this. The body does not navigate by maps. It breathes without consulting its history of breathing. It is warm without reviewing its records of past warmth. Right now, without any assistance from your accumulated knowledge of yourself, the heart is beating. The lungs are moving. Something is keeping the whole enterprise running with complete competence and zero self-consciousness. That is the territory. That has been the territory the whole time. Let the arms be heavy. Let the eyes be fully closed. The map can rest now. You are already in the place the map was trying to describe. If you drift off before the next door, that is exactly right. The fifth door will still be waiting, in a very different mountain, in the high cold of Tibet, where a scholar who had mastered every text in the tradition walked away from all of it in the middle of his greatest success and found, in that walking away, the thing the texts had been pointing toward all along. The Ganges plain of northern India in the 11th century carried the sound of birds at dawn the way a bowl carries water. The monsoon had broken by October, and in its aftermath, the air held a particular clarity. The sky so blue it was almost audible. The light on the temple spires of Nalanda so sharp it left after-images. In the courtyards of the great monastery, scholars moved with the habitual purpose of people who have important things to do and know exactly what they are. The smell of ink and old palm leaf drifted from the library windows. The bells marked the hours with the unhurried confidence of a place that has been marking hours for 5 centuries and expects to mark them for 500 more. High in the sky above all of this, birds moved on thermals, going where they wished, leaving nothing behind. There is a verse in the 7th chapter of the Dhammapada about birds. Their track is difficult to understand, like that of birds in the air. The verse is describing the path of someone who has finished the journey, who has set down grief and thrown off every fetter, whose movement through the world leaves no more trace than a bird moving through sky. No furrow, no imprint, no way to look back at where they have been and reconstruct the path from the evidence left behind. Most of us, lying awake in the dark, are not this person yet. We know exactly where we have been. The day has left tracks everywhere, in the body, in the mind, in the particular tightness that still lives between the shoulder blades. But the verse is not only describing a destination, it is pointing toward a quality of movement, a way of being in the world that loosens its grip on what it has passed through, that releases each hour as it ends, rather than carrying it forward into the next, a way of traveling that the birds have always known, which is that the sky does not remember them, and they do not require it to. Naropa understood this verse, but he spent years understanding it the wrong way first. He was born in 1016, into a family of the ruling caste in Bengal, a place of heat and monsoon and sacred rivers, where the great monasteries of the Buddhist world had built themselves along the banks of waterways that had been considered holy since before Buddhism itself arrived. He was intelligent in the way that certain children are intelligent before they have been taught what to do with intelligence, completely, hungrily, without the restraint that comes from knowing some paths lead nowhere. His parents arranged his marriage at 17, as was the custom, to a Brahmin woman named Vimaladipi. He spent 8 years in that marriage. Then, by mutual agreement, both of them entered monastic life. He was 28 when he walked through the gates of Nalanda. Nalanda was, in the 11th century, the greatest university the world had yet produced. A city of learning that housed 10,000 monks and scholars from across the Buddhist world and beyond. Scholars came from China, from Sri Lanka, from Tibet, from the island kingdoms of Southeast Asia, crossing deserts and mountain ranges and monsoon seas to study here. Its libraries contained hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, many of them the only copies in existence, stored in buildings with thick walls and careful humidity management, tended by monks whose entire vocation was the preservation of things that could not be replaced. Its lecture halls ran from dawn to well past dark, and the debates that happened in its corridors and courtyards drew audiences the way other cities drew audiences to ceremony or celebration. A student at Nalanda Arte slept and breathed argument in the best sense of that word, the careful, disciplined, rigorous examination of what was true and what was not, what was held with evidence and what was held by habit, what could survive exposure to the sharpest mind available and what quietly dissolved when actually questioned. The intellectual culture of this place was extraordinary, precise, and intoxicating. It was also, for someone with Naropa's particular quality of hunger, exactly the kind of place that could consume a life so completely that the life would not notice its consuming. He threw himself into it with the particular ferocity of someone who has been waiting his whole life for exactly this. He rose through it the way water rises, finding the level of the container it occupies. He mastered the Vinaya. He mastered the sutras. He mastered the Abhidharma and the Prajnaparamita and the tantric literature. He became known as a debater of exceptional skill, someone who could find the weakness in any argument and expose it cleanly, without cruelty, with the precision of a physician diagnosing a wound. He was given the title Guardian of the Northern Gate, one of 4 senior scholars responsible for defending Nalanda's teaching lineage against external philosophical challenge. He became the abbot. He had arrived at the highest possible achievement within the world he had entered. His track through that world was everywhere visible. The lineages he had mastered, the debates he had won, the thousands of students who moved through the monastery carrying pieces of what he had taught them. He was, in every measurable way, exactly where he was supposed to be. And something in him had been awake for years with a feeling he could not name. It arrived most clearly at night, when the debates were over and the lamps in the corridors were burning low and the library was locked for the evening and there was nothing left to do but sit with his own mind. He knew every teaching about the nature of the mind. He could recite the relevant passages in 7 languages. He could explain the distinctions between the major schools' positions on consciousness with precision and depth. And yet, in the silence of the monastery at night, with the distant sound of the Nalanda bells and the smell of sandalwood incense and the particular quality of darkness that an Indian summer night carries, something persisted underneath all the understanding that was not itself understood. He thought of it sometimes as a note he could almost hear, as if somewhere just below the level of everything he knew, the actual teaching was being played on an instrument he did not have ears for yet. This is the story of one night near the end of his time at Nalanda, when the note became impossible to ignore. He was in the library, working late as he often did, surrounded by manuscripts. The room was lit by oil lamps that cast moving shadows across the pages, and the smell of old palm leaf and fresh ink mixed with the night air coming through the high windows that faced the courtyard. He had been reading a commentary on the Prajnaparamita, preparing for a teaching he was to give the following week. He knew this text. He had taught from it dozens of times. The arguments were familiar to him, the way the path from his cell to the meditation hall was familiar. Walked so many times that the feet moved without needing the mind. And then, at some point in the late evening, he became aware of something in the room with him. Not a physical presence, more like a shift in the quality of the air, a subtle change in the way the lamplight fell. He looked up from his manuscript. The room was empty. He sat with the feeling for a moment, not quite able to name it. What arrived then, not as a sound or a vision, but as something closer to a recognition, was the question the tradition preserves in the language of encounter with a dakini. Do you understand the words? He did. Did he understand the meaning? And here, something inside him that had been quiet for a very long time refused to answer with the same speed and certainty that had answered every other question Nalanda had ever put to him. He understood the words. He knew the words in 7 languages. He could trace the transmission of every key term back through 5 centuries of commentary. But the meaning, the lived, actual, bone-deep meaning that the words were pointing toward, the territory the maps described, the thing that would make the verse about birds not something he could explain, but something he actually knew from inside, that was somewhere he had not yet been. He sat with this for a long time. The lamps burned lower. One of them guttered and went out, narrowing the circle of light. The courtyard outside fell completely silent, the way monastic courtyards become silent in the deep middle of the night, when even the most restless monks have finally slept. He could feel, for the first time in years, the gap between what he knew and what he was. It was not a small gap. It was the gap between a map and the country it was drawn to represent. The map was extraordinarily detailed. He had spent 30 years making it more detailed, but the country was outside the library, and he was not in it. He thought about the students who came to him with their most earnest questions and left with the correct answers. He was very good at providing correct answers. He had spent his entire career being praised for this, and the praise was not entirely unwarranted. The answers were correct, carefully derived, anchored in the tradition, defensible under any scrutiny. He could watch a student leave with a correct answer and know that the answer would serve them well in the lecture halls, in the examinations, in the debates. What he was less able to account for, sitting in the narrowing lamplight, was the occasional student who left with a correct answer and an expression that suggested they had been hoping for something the correct answer did not contain. He had always attributed this to the limitation of the student. Perhaps some people were simply not ready for the depth the teaching offered. Perhaps understanding took time to integrate. These were both true things. But tonight, for reasons he could not entirely explain, he found himself less interested in the limitation of the student than in the question the student's expression had been asking. Not what is the right answer. Something prior to that. Something more like, what is it that actually changes in a person when the teaching does what it is supposed to do? And had that happened in him? Could he find anywhere in the vast architecture of his understanding the actual experience the teaching was pointing toward, not the description, the thing itself? He was less certain, sitting in the narrowing lamplight. That answering was the same thing as understanding. He was less certain, this night, than he had been any other night of his 30 years at Nalanda. He left Nalanda 3 months later. There was no single precipitating event. It was more that once the gap had been seen, it could not be unseen. Every lecture he gave afterward, he was aware of it. Every debate he adjudicated, he could feel the distinction between the precision of the argument and the thing the argument was about. He continued to do his work well. He continued to teach with clarity. But something had changed in the quality of his attention. And the people closest to him noticed it, and he knew they noticed it. And this too became part of what he was carrying. He gave his robes to the monastery. He gave his manuscripts to the library. He asked the new abbot to receive them with the care they deserved. He said goodbye to the students who had gathered to see him off. Many of them bewildered. A few of them quietly understanding in the way that certain students understand things before they have words for them. He walked out of the gate in the direction of a name he had heard from someone. In a moment, he could not quite reconstruct afterward. A teacher called Tilopa, who was said to live at the margins of the ordinary world, who fished in rivers and slept in cremation grounds and taught in ways that no manuscript contained. He did not know where Tilopa was. He had no itinerary, no letter of introduction, no scholarly credential that would help him in the places he was going. He had, for the first time in 30 years, nothing to consult but the quality of his own attention, which had been his most reliable faculty all along, and which he had spent 30 years using almost entirely in the service of things that were not it. What the birds in the Dhammapada know, and what Naropa spent the years that followed learning in ways that were more demanding than anything Nalanda had offered him, is that freedom does not leave a track because it does not hold on to what it passes through. Naropa underwent 12 trials finding Tilopa, then 12 more under Tilopa's instruction. He was asked to do things that were humiliating, that were painful, that stripped away one by one the accumulated protections of a scholar's life, until what remained was something much simpler and much less defended. He was being taught not just new content, but a new relationship to experience itself, passing through without gripping, entering fully without requiring a memorial. What the birds in the Dhammapada know is that freedom does not leave a track because it does not hold on to what it passes through. Every experience is fully inhabited and fully released. Every moment is entered with complete presence and departed from without residue. The path of the birds through the sky is difficult to trace, not because they are hidden or inaccessible, but because the sky does not keep records, and neither do they. This is the quality of attention the 7th chapter of the Dhammapada is describing. Not a blank or detached emptiness. The bird does not fly with closed eyes. It is wholly present to the wind and the thermal and the shift of light. But it does not hold. It does not grip the air it has already passed through. Most of us have been gripping all day. The meeting that replayed 3 times on the way home and twice more after dinner. The small injustice rehearsed until the feeling around it is worn, smooth as river stone, but no less heavy. The plan built and rebuilt and refined and reconsidered and built again. The version of tomorrow you have been preparing for since before yesterday ended. The conversation that might happen and the way you have already rehearsed what you would say, and the counter-response, and the counter-response. Until a conversation that has not yet occurred and may never occur has taken up more of the day than any conversation that actually happened. These are the tracks we leave behind ourselves in the dark. The way we know where we have been because we are still present in most of the rooms we have passed through. The door never quite closed. The fire never quite out. The verse is not asking you to be a different kind of person. It is not asking for the discipline of non-attachment or the achievement of some rarefied state that requires years of practice to approach. It is asking something simpler and much more immediate. What would it feel like to set down one thing, not everything? Not the whole day with all its weight. One thing. One room you could leave tonight and let the door close quietly behind you. The room does not disappear when you leave it. The meeting is still in the past. The injustice is still what it was. The conversation you rehearsed is still available tomorrow if it turns out to be needed. Nothing is lost by letting the hand open. The bird leaves the air unmarked. The air loses nothing. Naropa walked out of Nalanda with nothing but the direction of his own longing. He found Tilopa eventually, after years of trials that burned away everything that was merely performed and left only what was essential. The 12 trials and the 12 hardships, and the 12 years of instruction, all of them leading to the Mahamudra transmission that the Kagyu school has been passing down through its lineage for 1,000 years since. But the moment that made everything else possible was the night in the library, when he sat with his own not knowing and did not immediately paper it over with what he understood about not knowing. He just sat with it. In that sitting, for the first time, something was in the actual territory rather than reading about it from the library window. That sitting was itself the first step of the path of the birds. The bird in the verse does not think about flying. It simply does not hold the air it has moved through. Let the body settle deeper into what is beneath it. Let the weight be fully given, the way a bird gives its weight to a branch and trusts it completely. Let the breath move without needing to count it or direct it or get it right. Somewhere in the chest or the belly, there may be something still gripping, still turning, still holding. You do not need to force it open. Just notice that it is there. The noticing is itself a kind of release. Like swans who have left their lake, the verse says, they leave home after home behind. Not with effort, not with sorrow, simply because the lake is behind them and the sky is ahead. And the sky has always been there, unmarked and complete, waiting for the next bird. The sky does not ask the bird to prove it deserves to fly through it. It simply receives each wing stroke and releases it, unchanged, ready for the next. You do not need to finish the journey tonight. You only need to let the hand be a little less tight on what it has been holding. One room at a time. One thing set down. The rest can wait until morning. And morning will come, whether you carry tonight's residue into it or not. If sleep comes now, you do not need to resist it or track it, or understand why it came when it did. Let it arrive the way the bird arrives at the branch it has chosen, without ceremony, without a record of the flight. You do not need to stay awake for any of this. The night knows how to hold you. Let it. The sixth door opens in a place that Naropa himself might have recognized. In Tang Dynasty China, where a master named Mazu Daoyi stood in an ordinary courtyard and made an observation so simple that everyone who heard it spent the rest of their lives understanding it. Not the words. The thing the words were pointing at, which was already there, in their courtyard, in the smell of wood smoke and monastery food, and the particular quality of an early autumn afternoon that is not quite summer and not quite winter, and is, for that reason, completely itself. The province of Jiangxi in the Tang dynasty had red earth. You noticed it immediately when you arrived. The soil, the color of old brick, the paths between the villages and monasteries stained with it, the sandals of every monk in the region carrying a faint rust tinge that no amount of washing entirely removed. In autumn, the persimmon trees were heavy with orange fruit, and the smoke from the monastery kitchens rose straight in the still air and then bent in the small winds that came down from the hills without announcement. The rivers ran red after heavy rain. The water, the color of diluted clay, moving through valleys of bamboo and pine, with an unhurried authority that the Tang dynasty masters often used as a teaching image. The river does not hurry. The river does not stop. The river is simply going where it is going without the drama of intention. Mazu lived here for the last 40 years of his life. The red earth got into everything. The sandals, the robes, the manuscripts, the tea, Mazu Daoyi lived in Jiangxi for much of his teaching life, and the landscape suited him. He was not a man of unnecessary movement. The records describe him walking like a bull, looking about like a tiger, his presence in a room immediately tangible, the way certain people are immediately tangible, not through any performance but through a quality of occupation, of being fully in the space they inhabit. When he sat in the teaching hall, his students described the sensation of the hall itself becoming more solid. He had not always been this way. There had been a time when he was a young monk at Mount Heng in Hunan, sitting in meditation for hours every day with the intention of becoming a Buddha. And his teacher, Nanyue Huairang, had walked past his hermitage one afternoon, observed him sitting for a long moment in the particular concentrated stillness of someone performing seriousness. I said nothing, and then sat down on a rock nearby with a clay roof tile and begun rubbing it methodically on the stone surface. Mazu held his posture. He had been sitting for 3 hours already. His legs ached in a way he had decided to accept as evidence of his dedication. He was not going to be the kind of monk who looked up at distractions. He looked up. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Making a mirror," Nanyue said, without pausing his rubbing. Mazu looked at the tile. Nanyue had been the student of the 6th patriarch, Huineng. He was not a man who did things without purpose. "You cannot make a mirror by polishing a tile," Mazu said. His teacher stopped rubbing and looked at him with the kind of patience that is also, precisely and gently, not patience at all. "You cannot become a Buddha by sitting in meditation," he said. Mazu was quiet for a long time. The mountain air moved through the pine trees above them with a sound like slow water. The tile in Nanyue's hand was an ordinary roof tile, grey and slightly rough, available in any quantity from the pile near the building they had recently repaired. It would never be a mirror, and yet a mirror was what Nanyue had said he wanted to make. Then he asked, "What, then, should I do?" His teacher said, "When you are driving a cart and it stops moving, which do you whip, the cart or the ox?" This question was not answered that afternoon. It took Mazu years to understand it, or rather, years to stop trying to answer it and simply discover that the answer had been there all along, in the driving of the cart, in the hands holding the reins, in the sound the pine trees made, in the ordinary mountain wind of an ordinary afternoon, in the simple fact of being exactly where he was without needing it to be somewhere else on the way to becoming a Buddha. He was 50 or so when this teaching arrived at full ripeness in him. He had spent decades by then in the Red Earth province of Jiangxi, teaching from the simplest possible platform, using the encounters of daily life as his text. He did not write treatises. He did not compose elaborate commentaries. He walked like a bull and taught like a tiger, and sent his students back to the kitchen and the garden the way a physician sends patients home to rest. Because the cure was not in the clinic. He had by then confirmed the awakening of hundreds of students. The records count more than 130 men and women who studied with him across his years in Jiangxi, and among them were Baizhang Huaihai, from whom the tradition of formal monastic codes descends, and Nanquan Puyuan, who taught the great Zhao Zhou. The lineage that came from Mazu's teaching shaped everything that came after. He had, by any measure, arrived at whatever there was to arrive at. The pile of roof tiles outside the monastery had been untouched for decades. No one was polishing them. When he found the words for what had been living in him all this time, They were the simplest words available. Ordinary mind is the way. This is the story of one afternoon in 1775, when a young monk named Zhonghua came to study with Mazu at his monastery at Gonggong Mountain in Jiangxi. Zhonghua had traveled for 11 days from the monastery in Shandong, where he had been practicing for 4 years. He was 26, capable of long periods of concentrated sitting, genuinely earnest, in the way that the best young monks are genuinely earnest. The kind of student who arrives early to every teaching and takes careful notes and reads the notes again afterward, and is nonetheless haunted by the feeling that understanding is happening next door to him rather than in him. He was carrying the weight of a question he had not been able to resolve through any of the practice he had done so far. The question was not philosophical in the way that examination questions are philosophical. It was more like a pressure, something he could feel in his chest when he thought about it, which was most of the time. The question was, am I doing this correctly? Is the practice working? How will I know when I am getting somewhere? And underneath all of these, the one that drove the others, what if I have been doing this for years and nothing has actually changed? He arrived at the monastery in the late afternoon of a day in early autumn. The red earth of the paths between the monastery buildings had been swept clean, and the kitchen smell of rice and wood smoke drifted from somewhere he could not see. He had been told to present himself to the abbot immediately upon arrival, but the monk who met him at the gate said the abbot was occupied in the vegetable garden, and it would be better to wait. He waited near the gate for a while, and then, not knowing the protocol precisely, he walked in the direction of the garden to find out how long the wait might be. He found Mazu alone among rows of cabbages and winter melon, pulling weeds with the particular attentiveness of someone who is not thinking about anything other than pulling weeds. His robe sleeves were rolled up to his elbows. The red earth was dark with moisture where he had just watered. The smell of bruised cabbage leaves was sharp and green in the cooling air. The evening light was coming through the pine trees at the garden's edge at an angle that made everything look slightly luminous. The way things look in the last hour. Before dark, when the light is horizontal and golden and the shadows are long. Mazu's robe was dirty at the knees. His hands moved steadily through the soil. Zhonghua hesitated, then bowed and said he had come to study. Mazu looked up. He studied the young monk for a moment, with the directness that people who knew him described as comfortable and discomforting at the same time, like being looked at by something that had no reason to be anything other than what it was. "Have you eaten?" Mazu asked. Zhonghua said he had not, that he had arrived just now. Mazu stood, brushed the dirt from his hands, and began walking back toward the kitchen. "Come," he said. "First eat." Zhonghua followed, not sure what to do with this. He had composed, on the 11-day journey, several versions of the question he wanted to ask. He had prepared for a formal teaching hall encounter of the kind he had read about in the Chan records. The sharp exchange, the unexpected response, the moment of breakthrough. He had not prepared for being walked to a kitchen and fed. They ate in silence, which, in the context of monastery life, meant nothing unusual, but which Zhonghua experienced as heavy with significance, as if the silence itself were a teaching he was supposed to be extracting meaning from. He watched Mazu eat. The master ate with complete attention and no ceremony, the way a healthy person eats when they are hungry. After the meal, Mazu poured tea and sat with Zhonghua in the small room adjacent to the kitchen where the monastery's cooking staff took their meals. The tea was the local variety, slightly astringent, with a faint smokiness from the charcoal brazier. Zhonghua asked his question. He had been practicing for 4 years, he said, and he wanted to know if his practice was correct, and how he would know when progress was happening, and whether there was something he should be doing differently. Mazu drank his tea. He did not answer immediately. After a moment he said, "When you were walking from the gate to the garden just now, what were you doing?" Zhonghua considered this. "Walking," he said, "looking for you. And when you were eating just now, eating. And now, drinking tea." "Yes," Mazu said. "And you have been doing this your whole life. Walking when you walk, eating when you eat, drinking tea when you drink tea. Nothing missing, nothing extra. This is what ordinary mind means. Not the mind that has been purified into something it was not before. The mind that is simply doing what it is doing, completely, without the second activity of monitoring whether it is doing it correctly." Zhonghua was quiet for a moment. "That seems too simple," he said. "Most true things are," Mazu said. "But I have been practicing for 4 years," Zhonghua said. "Sitting in meditation for hours every day, reading the texts, following the precepts carefully. If ordinary mind is the way, what have I been doing all this time?" "You have been learning to stop doing the extra thing," Mazu said. "You have been learning, very slowly, how to walk without also monitoring your walking, how to eat without also evaluating your eating. The practice does not install something. It removes the removing. It unbuilds the extra layer." He set down his tea. "The verse in the Dhammapada says, 'The path of the awakened person is difficult to understand, like that of birds in the air.' Difficult to understand because there is no track left, no trace. Not because the bird has done something extraordinary, but because the bird has done nothing extraordinary. It has flown. That is all. Flying is what birds do, and the sky receives every flight and releases it without record." This seemed to Zhonghua, sitting in the small room adjacent to a kitchen in the Red Earth province of Jiangxi, as both the simplest and the most difficult thing he had ever been told. He had spent 4 years building an elaborate apparatus for becoming something different from what he was. He had been trying to polish a tile into a mirror, and his master was sitting across from him drinking tea and saying, "The mirror was never a tile. It was always already a mirror. You have just been polishing it in the wrong direction." He did not fully understand this that evening. The words were clear. The words were as clear as any words he had ever heard. But understanding words and inhabiting what the words pointed at were, as Mazu had just said, 2 different activities, and he had been training in one of them for 4 years without adequately practicing the other. He stayed at the monastery for 2 years. Mazu never gave him a more formal teaching than the one in the kitchen, and the pattern of those 2 years was almost entirely ordinary. He swept, he cooked, he worked in the garden where he had first found Mazu. He sat in meditation. He carried water. He repaired a section of wall that had crumbled after the autumn rains. He fell ill once for a week and was tended by an older monk with the same attentive practicality that was the monastery's primary atmosphere. There were no dramatic encounters, no sudden moments of breakthrough that he could later point to as the day things changed. But gradually, across those 2 years, something simplified. the extra layer of monitoring thinned. He would be walking between the buildings in the rain and simply be in the rain rather than in the commentary about whether he was being sufficiently present to the rain. He would eat his morning rice and actually taste it, without the simultaneous assessment of whether he was tasting it in the correct meditative manner. The journal he had kept throughout his 4 years of practice at the previous monastery, the careful record of his progress and his failures and his questions and his insights, he stopped writing in. Not because he decided to stop. He simply noticed, one morning, that he had not written in it for 2 weeks, and that nothing important had been lost. These are small things. They are so small that Zhonghua, had he been asked at the time whether he was progressing, would have said he had no way to measure it. But Mazu spent 30 years teaching in Jiangxi, and the tradition counts over 100 confirmed students among those who passed through his doors, many of them going on to become great teachers in their own right. And what he was teaching, all of them, was essentially the same thing he taught Zhonghua in a kitchen over a cup of tea. The most ordinary thing there is, which is exactly what it said on the label, ordinary mind. The mind that is not performing being the mind. The bird that is not trying to fly. The person who is simply in the rain, in the garden, in the late afternoon light with dirty hands, pulling weeds because the weeds are there to be pulled. If you drift off now, that is exactly right. This is the mind that does not need to stay awake. This is the ordinary mind, doing the ordinary thing, which is to rest when rest is available. The second insight Mazu spent 30 years offering is gentler than the first, and arrives quietly after the first has had time to settle. It does not come as a dramatic revelation. It comes the way a taste comes, when you stop thinking about tasting and simply eat, without announcement, already present. If ordinary mind is already the way, then right now, in this dark room, in this body, in this particular night, with its specific sounds and temperature and weight of blanket and quality of silence, nothing is missing. Not as a consolation, not as a reframe designed to make you feel better about where you are. As the simple fact of the case, the body is breathing. The mind is present. The night is exactly what a night is. There is no tile being polished toward a future mirror. There is only this. This moment is complete. Not on its way to being complete when some condition is met. When sleep finally arrives, or the worry finally stops, or some better version of tonight is achieved. Complete as it is. The way the meal Mazu served Zhonghua was complete before it was a teaching, because it was simply food given to someone who was hungry, on a regular evening, in an ordinary kitchen, in a monastery in the Red Earth province of Jiangxi, in the middle of the 8th century, and the middle of a life, and the middle of a practice that had no middle. The bird in the Dhammapada leaves no track, not because it has achieved some special state of non-attachment, but because it never needed to leave one. It was flying. Then it had flown. The sky held neither the going nor the coming, and was unchanged by both. Most of us arrive at sleep the way Zhonghua arrived at the monastery gate, with an agenda. With a list of conditions the night needs to meet before we can consider it successful. With the second activity running alongside the first, not just lying down but monitoring the lying down. Not just breathing but checking whether the breath is relaxed enough. Not just resting but supervising the rest. Mazu's teaching does not ask you to stop any of this through willpower or discipline. It asks something different. It asks you to notice that alongside all of this monitoring, something else is already happening. The breath is already moving. The body is already heavy. The eyelids already want to close. The ordinary mind, the one that does not need to become something, has been here all day doing ordinary things, and it is here now, doing the most ordinary thing of all. Let the breath come without directing it. Let the eyelids be heavy without fighting that heaviness. The ordinary mind that Mazu was pointing at has been here all day, walking when you walked, working when you worked, worrying when it worried, and resting when it rested, and arriving here, at this bed, in this dark, the way a bird arrives at a branch, without the journey needing to be a problem to be solved. You do not need to make a mirror tonight. You are not a tile. The sky does not ask for your track, and would not keep it if you left one. The ordinary is enough. It has always been enough. It is, if Mazu was right, the entire way. The seventh door opens in a different kind of mountain, in the kingdom of Bhutan, where a scholar who had written more about the Dharma than almost any person of his century spent the last years of his life learning to hold it all lightly. He had a different relationship to the ordinary than Mazu did. He had to find his way to it through a great deal of accumulated weight, the way a river finds the sea, not in a straight line but through the terrain that is actually there. In the high valleys of southern Tibet, where the Drukpa Kagyu monasteries cling to hillsides above rivers that carry snowmelt from passes too high for trees to grow, the winters arrive without apology. By November, the passes to the north are closed. The valleys hold a cold that is clean rather than harsh. The sky above the peaks, so blue it appears to be a different color than the sky of lower places. The light on the snow-covered ridges, so clear that shadows have sharp edges. And the silence that fills in between the monastery bells and the wind off the glaciers is the kind of silence that makes writing seem like an extremely small activity, which is perhaps why Pema Karpo did so much of it. He was the most learned man of his century in the Drukpa tradition, and possibly in any tradition of the Himalayan world. He had written 24 volumes by the time he was 60. The subjects ranged from the most technical to the most intimate, philosophy and logic, Buddhist history spanning from the first teachings to his own era, commentary on the major texts of the Kagyu lineage, complete instructions on Mahamudra meditation in the form the Drukpa school had inherited from Tilopa, through Naropa, through Milarepa, through Gampopa, and refined across 400 years of mountain practice. He had written on poetics, on astrology, on the technical requirements of ritual, on the geographic history of the sacred sites of Tibet. Gene Smith, one of the great scholars of Tibetan literature, compared the breadth of his work to that of the fifth Dalai Lama. He had systematized the teachings of an entire lineage. This is not a small thing. A lineage without systematization is a river without banks, spreading sideways across the landscape until its force dissipates. Pema Karpo gave the Drukpa Kagyu tradition its banks. He gave it the infrastructure of text that would allow it to survive not only the political upheavals of his own century but the centuries that followed, including the one in which his own two incarnations would split his lineage geographically, one remaining in Tibet and one going south to found the kingdom of Bhutan. He had written more careful words about the nature of mind than any single person in his school before him. And he had done all of this while also serving as the head of that school, teaching hundreds of students, managing the competing obligations of a large religious institution, traveling the mountain, circuits a Tibetan leader of his standing was expected to travel, and living in the spaces between all of this. The interior life of a genuine practitioner whose relationship with the teachings he wrote about was not merely scholarly. He was, in other words, a man who understood the weight of accumulated knowledge from the inside. He had been carrying it for decades. This is the story of one afternoon near the end of his life, at the monastery at Jar in southern Tibet. In the winter of 1590, he was 63, and he had been unwell for 2 years. The particular kind of unwellness that is not acute but cumulative, the body expressing in its own language what happens when a person has done a great deal for a very long time. He had headaches that arrived without announcement and stayed for days. His hands, which had held a brush almost daily for 40 years, ached in cold weather with the memory of everything they had written. He slept less well than he once had, waking before dawn sometimes to find the room full of the particular darkness of a Tibetan monastery night. The butter lamps in the shrine room casting a faint glow through the wooden walls. He continued to write. He continued to teach. But there was a different quality to his days now, a slower rhythm and a different kind of attention, as if the mountain itself were reminding him that it had been here before he arrived and would be here after he was gone, and that this was not a sad fact but simply the kind of fact that changes how you sit in a room. The young monk who served as his principal attendant that winter was named Kedrup, 19 years old, arrived 6 months earlier from a village in the Chumbi Valley. He was the second son of a barley farmer who had sent him to the monastery at 12 because it was the right thing to do for a bright second son, and also because there was not quite enough land for 2. He had spent 7 years doing what young monks do, learning the chants, the ritual sequences, the basic texts, the protocols of monastic life. He had developed, somewhere in that 7 years, a genuine interest in the teachings that had surprised him when he first noticed it. The way an interest in something beautiful surprises you when you suddenly see it clearly. He was still in the early stage of practice where everything feels enormous and consequential. He had come to Jar specifically because Pema Karpo was there, the most important living teacher of the lineage, the person whose written works contained the most careful map of the territory Kedrup was trying to enter. He had been given the assignment of attending the master as a combination of honor and practical necessity. Since the older monks were occupied with the winter teaching schedule, Kedrup had been reading, in whatever hours were not occupied with attending duties, one of the 24 volumes. He was working through the section on Mahamudra, the teachings on the nature of mind that the Drukpa Kagyu tradition had inherited from Tilopa and Naropa and Milarepa and Gampopa, and refined across 5 centuries into a body of instruction of extraordinary depth. The Mahamudra text described, in language that was precise without being cold, the recognition of the mind's fundamental nature, a recognition that the tradition said was both the simplest thing and the hardest. Simple because it was always already present. Hard because the mind trained to grasp and analyze could not grasp or analyze its way to it. Kedrup was reading carefully, making notes in the margins of a separate sheet of paper, trying to understand each passage before moving to the next. He was making good progress. He felt he was understanding it. He was less certain he was experiencing what the understanding was pointing toward. One afternoon he brought Pema Karpo his afternoon tea and found the master not writing, as he usually was at this hour, but sitting at the window of his study, looking out at the ridge across the valley where the snow line began and the rock below it was the dark grey of old slate in the winter light. The tea was set down. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Kedrup looked at the desk. The current manuscript was there, the brush resting across the inkstone, the last line written and not yet followed by another. A bowl of water for rinsing the brush sat beside it, the water slightly grey with old ink, a thin film of it on the surface. The study held the smell of old paper and ink and burning juniper from the brazier in the corner. And under all of that, the particular clean, cold smell of Tibetan mountain air coming through the wooden shutters. On the shelves around the walls, the volumes Pema Karpo had written were stacked in their silk wrappings, bound with cords of yellow and red, each spine labelled in his hand, each one a year or several years of his life. Kedrup asked, without thinking about whether it was the appropriate moment, "How many words have you written?" "Rinpoche?" Pema Karpo turned from the window. He looked at Kedrup for a moment, not unkindly, with the assessment of a teacher reading a student to see what the question was really asking. "I have not counted," he said. "Many." Kedrup was quiet for a moment. Then he asked what he actually wanted to ask. The question that had been sitting underneath the first one, "Rinpoche, after writing all of this, after explaining the nature of mind in so many different ways, what is the single most important thing you have found?" Pema Karpo was quiet for so long that Kedrup began to think he had committed some error, asked a question that could not be asked or should not have been phrased that way. He prepared to apologize. Then Pema Karpo smiled, very slightly. He picked up the brush. He dipped it in the ink, and he wrote a single character on the blank paper in front of him, carefully, with the attention of someone writing something they have thought about for a very long time. Then he set the brush down. Kedrup looked at the character. It was the Tibetan letter for emptiness, for the word that points toward the nature of all things, their radical openness, the way nothing is fixed or solid in the way we experience it to be, the way the self and the world are not two separate things, but two aspects of a single process that leaves no residue when it is finally understood. That, Pema Karpo said, is not the answer. That is the word that points toward the answer. The answer is not a word. After everything I have written, the answer is still not a word. 1,000 volumes could not contain it. A single moment of actual recognition weighs more than all of them. Kedrup looked at the character on the paper, then at the stacked volumes on the shelves. "But the volumes are necessary," he said. "To understand, you need all of that preparation." Pema Karpo looked at the shelves. He had spent his life filling them. He turned back to the window, to the ridge and the snow and the winter light. "Some of it," he said. "Yes, but not as much as you think, and not in the way you think." The verse from the Dhammapada that the Buddha spoke to that wandering teacher is the most honest thing I know. Better than 1,000 hollow words is one word that brings peace. Better than 1,000 hollow words. Not that 1,000 hollow words have no value, but that one word of actual meeting, one moment of actual recognition, outweighs all of them. He paused. "I have written well," he said. "I believe that. I have explained things correctly and carefully, and the explanations have helped people who needed that kind of help. But I have also written sometimes because writing felt like understanding, and it is not the same thing. You can describe a mountain so precisely that another person can find it, and you yourself can remain in the valley having never climbed it. The map is useful. The climbing is something else entirely. Kedrup sat with this for a while. The brazier ticked in the corner as the juniper burned lower, the smell of it clean and slightly resinous in the cold, study air. Outside the window, the light on the slate ridge had shifted to the grey gold of late afternoon. That brief window, before the mountains go blue with shadow and the sky above them becomes the color of ice. At this elevation, at this time of year, the change happened quickly. The light had very little patience. What should I do? Then, Kedrup asked. With the volumes. With all of it. Learn it, Pema Karpo said. Learn it well, but not as a performance and not to impress anyone. Because the map genuinely helps when the terrain is unfamiliar. I do not regret a single volume, but there is a practice that all 24 volumes are pointing toward, and it is not a 25th volume. Each of them is a different finger pointing at the same moon. He paused, looking out at the ridge. Words are tools, he said. A tool is not a home. At some point, you set down the tool and simply live in the place the tool helped you reach. He turned back to his manuscript and picked up the brush, writing several more lines with a looseness that younger monks had often noticed in his late work. The calligraphy relaxed in a way that earlier volumes were not, as if the hand no longer needed to prove anything to itself. Kedrup watched him for a moment, then took the empty tea bowl and left the room quietly. He passed the volumes on the shelves as he went out, their silk wrappings in yellow and red, cords neatly tied. He had been reading one of them for 3 months, working carefully, making notes. He would finish it. But something had shifted very slightly in the quality of his reading, a loosening of the grip, the beginning of a recognition that the text was a finger pointing at something, and that the pointing and the something were different, and that at some point the finger would have to be set down before the moon could actually be seen. The verse that frames this door in the Dhammapada is deceptively simple. Better than 1,000 hollow words is one word that brings peace. The verse is not anti-intellectual. The Buddha was not saying do not study or do not think or do not build the elaborate understanding that serious practice requires. He had given thousands of discourses. He had spoken in the most precise philosophical language his tradition possessed. He knew the value of careful words. What the verse is pointing toward is something that even Pema Karpo, after a lifetime of exceptionally careful words, found necessary to sit with: the gap between description and recognition. The map and the mountain. The word emptiness, written in perfect calligraphy on clean paper, and the actual experience of the openness the word is pointing toward. Most of us have accumulated, across the years, a great many words. Not necessarily written words. The words we use to describe ourselves to ourselves. The running internal commentary that provides a continuous explanation of who we are and why we are as we are, and what the world is doing and what it means. This commentary is not without value. Some of it is genuinely useful. It helps us navigate, helps us relate, helps us make sense of things that would otherwise be simply overwhelming. Pema Karpo was right that the 24 volumes had helped people who needed that kind of help. But all of it is a map. And a map, consulted continuously, becomes mistaken for the territory. The map of the self becomes the self. The description of experience becomes the experience. And lying in the dark tonight, the commentary running, it is worth asking, is this map helping me navigate right now? Or is it simply running because it has always run at this hour, in this darkness? Describing a situation that does not require description and recommending actions that cannot be taken until morning. Pema Karpo, at 63, with 24 volumes behind him and the winter light on the ridge across the valley in front of him, was distinguishing between these two things. Not rejecting the volumes, not rejecting the words, holding them correctly as tools that serve a purpose and are set down when the purpose is served. What the Dhammapada is offering in these verses is an invitation to notice when the commentary is running and nothing is actually being said. The 1,000 hollow words. The reviewing and rehearsing that sounds like thinking but is not going anywhere, is not producing insight, is simply the map, folded and refolded in the dark. One word that brings peace. Not a specific word. Not a formula. The quality of a word that lands rather than circulates. The quality of a thought that opens rather than returns to what it already knows. Right now, if the mind is producing its 1,000 words, you do not have to silence them. The 1,000 words are not the problem. The exhaustion of being in them continuously is the problem. The way even a beautiful melody becomes intolerable if you cannot find the rests between the notes. You do not have to find the one word. You do not have to achieve the recognition Pema Karpo was describing. Just let the production slow slightly, the way a river slows when the gradient eases, without any act of will. Simply by arriving at a place that is more level. Somewhere in the body there is already a place that is more level. Not manufactured. Not achieved. The belly, perhaps, rising and falling without commentary. The hands, resting without agenda. The space between one thought and the next, very brief. Very quiet, not requiring anything from you. Let the shoulders drop a little further. Let the breath be whatever it is, slow or uneven or barely noticeable. It does not matter. The body is not running commentary about itself. The body is simply here, the heart beating, the chest moving, the weight sinking deeper into whatever surface is holding it. The 1,000 words do not prevent rest. They are just words. They move through the mind the way weather moves through the sky that Pema Karpo was looking at when the question was asked. The sky does not hold the weather. The sky holds everything lightly, including its own clarity. This is the quality that 24 volumes of careful instruction are trying to point toward. Not to add more weight, but to eventually arrive at the place where the weight can be set down, where the brush can rest across the inkstone, where the window can be looked through rather than read like another text, where the one word that brings peace is not a word at all, but the quality of the space between all words, which has been here the whole time. You are somewhere that the words have never reached. You have always been there. Not because the words are wrong or harmful, but because they are made of a different material than awareness itself, and awareness does not need them to know what it is. Pema Karpo, 2 years from the end of his life, looking out at the winter ridge in the afternoon light, was not rejecting the 24 volumes. He was noticing, with the clarity that sometimes comes when a person no longer needs to be anything other than what they already are, that the volumes and the knowing are different weights. The volumes were extraordinary. The knowing was prior to all of them. Rest in that for a moment, and let the 1,000 words go wherever words go when they are finished. If sleep comes now, let it come. You have reached the last door already. The 8th door opens now, gently. The last one tonight. In Cambodia, in the early 20th century, in a country learning in the hardest possible circumstances what it means to preserve what is ancient and beautiful without clutching it so tightly that it cannot be passed on. Before first light in Phnom Penh, the city is briefly quiet, not silent. The Mekong is never silent. The river moving through its wide channel with the permanent soft sound of something very large going somewhere without hurry, carrying the water of 4 countries toward the sea. The cyclos and the market carts have not yet started. The roosters have started. And from Wadawunalam, on the riverbank, if you are lying in the right position in the right room and the air is moving in the right direction from the east, you can hear, not quite hear, but almost feel, the sound of the morning chanting beginning in the Vihara before dawn. It is 1943. Chuon Nath is 60 years old. Somewhere below the window, on the broad boulevard that runs along the Mekong, a cart horse has started, the sound of its hooves on the road surface distinct and then fading. Across the river, in the province of Kundal, the rice paddies are beginning to emerge from the dark as grey-green shapes in the early light. A temple bell from somewhere further in the city rings once, twice, 3 times, and then is quiet. He has been at Wat Onalam, on and off, for more than 40 years. He arrived here as a young monk in the early 1900s, came to study Pali under the scholars who had made this temple one of the centers of Buddhist learning in Southeast Asia, and stayed because there was always more to learn, and then, when the learning was sufficient, because there was always more to do. What he has done spans a range that would seem, to anyone meeting him for the first time, impossible for a single life. He had mastered Pali, the ancient language in which the Buddha's teachings were preserved, with a precision that would allow him, years later, to oversee the translation of the entire Pali canon into Khmer, a project of such scope that it would take teams of monks and scholars decades to complete. He had traveled to Hanoi to study Sanskrit at the French Scholarly Institute, sitting in lecture rooms alongside colonial academics who were surprised to find a Cambodian monk who could read the original texts better than most of them. He had helped compile, from the beginning, the first modern Khmer dictionary, a project commissioned by the royal court in 1915 and still, in 1943, not yet complete, he had written the words to Cambodia's national anthem. He had taught Pali and Sanskrit and Khmer to generations of young monks. He had pushed, sometimes against considerable resistance, for the Buddhist Sangha to modernize its methods without losing its roots, to use printing presses instead of only palm leaf manuscripts, to teach the Vinaya rigorously to both monks and lay people, to ground the practice in the actual Pali texts rather than in accumulated custom that had drifted from its sources. He had done all of this under French colonialism, which meant doing it in a country that the colonial administration had been working since the establishment of the Protectorate in 1863 to reshape in its own image. The French intended to replace Khmer with French as the language of education and administration. They introduced secular European schooling that made no space for the monastery as a center of learning. They produced, deliberately, a class of Cambodians who thought in French categories and felt slightly embarrassed by the traditions that had shaped their grandparents. Chuon Nath had spent 40 years being, quietly and without confrontation, and without the kind of visible political resistance that the colonial administration could easily identify and suppress. A person who made that project more difficult than it would otherwise have been. Not through opposition, but through continuation. Not by fighting what the French were doing, but by continuing what the Khmer tradition had always done. So that when the pressure eased, there would still be something intact to return to. He had done it by doing the most patient thing available, preserving things carefully so that they could be given away, making the texts available, making the language precise and documented, making the tradition translatable into the modern world without losing what made it itself. This is the secret of his life's work that is not often named directly. He was not collecting. He was not building an institution that required him to stand at the center of it forever. He was translating, compiling, teaching, transmitting, always with the understanding that the texts and the language and the traditions were not his, and that his relationship to them was not one of ownership but of custody. The best custodian is always the one preparing to pass the thing on rather than the one holding it most tightly. Water that is held too tightly stops moving. The river that is its own container, moving without clinging to the banks, carries everything it needs to carry and arrives at the sea having lost nothing essential. Chuon Nath was the river, not the banks. In 1943, on an ordinary morning in March, before the city woke, before even the market carts had begun their rounds, he was lying on his mat in his room at Wat Unalam, not yet risen, listening to the sound of the chanting beginning in the vihara below. The dry season was ending. In a few weeks the first rains would come, and the smell of the air outside would change overnight from dust to earth. The ancient smell of the Cambodian wet season that the rice farmers had been reading for 1,500 years. He was not young anymore, though he did not often think in those terms. The French would be here for 2 more years before the Japanese interregnum, and then independence would come in 1953, and then other complications. But none of that was yet. In 1943, there was still only the familiar rhythm of Phnom Penh, the colonial city of wide French boulevards and wooden Khmer houses, and the ever-present sound and smell of the river. His knees gave him trouble. He had been unwell several times in the past few years with the illnesses that visit monks who have spent a lifetime in the Mekong Delta's particular combination of heat and wet. He was deep in the middle of the dictionary project, the work that would occupy the remaining decades of his life, the work of finding and verifying and defining the meaning of every word in the Khmer language at a moment when the language itself was under pressure from every direction. The chanting below was the Mangala Sutta, the discourse on auspiciousness, one of the most familiar texts in the Theravada tradition. It was recited at this hour in monasteries across Cambodia and Thailand and Sri Lanka and Burma. The same Pali syllables that had been chanted before dawn for 2,500 years, in places that had never heard of each other, by monks who had no way to know they were doing the same thing in the same pre-dawn hour. The sound of the chanting rising in one place while it rose in another, connecting them not through communication but through the shared fact of continuation. Chuon Nath had translated this text. He had taught it in 3 languages. He knew every word and every commentary. He had, at some point across the decades, stopped thinking of it as a text he understood and started experiencing it as a sound that was simply part of the air at this hour. The way the river was part of the air, carrying meaning the way rivers carry water, available to anyone who came to drink and not diminished by the drinking. He lay on his mat and let the sound come to him through the wooden walls and the pre-dawn dark. There was nothing to understand. He had understood this text for 50 years. He knew its grammatical structure, its historical context, the commentaries that had been written about it in the 5th century and the 12th century, and more recently, he knew the scholarly debates about certain translations. He knew all of this the way you know the back of your own hand, which is to say, well enough to stop paying it the kind of attention that extracts information and simply be with it. The sound of the chanting and the sound of the river outside and the first call of a bird somewhere in the temple courtyard and the particular quality of the air just before dawn in a city near the equator, slightly cooler than it will be in an hour, with a smell of river water and temple incense and the distant beginning of wood smoke from the first kitchen fires. He was not practicing. He was not achieving anything. He was not even, in any technical sense, meditating. He was lying on his mat in the last dark before morning, his body making the small adjustments that bodies make, his breath finding its own pace without his attention on it, the sounds of the chanting and the river and the waking city entering him, the way sounds enter a room through an open window, without asking permission and without being refused. He was listening in the way that only becomes available after years of knowing something well enough to stop knowing it, not extracting information, not confirming understanding, simply present to the texture of the sounds themselves, the rise and fall of the Pali syllables, the resonance of many voices settling into a single sound. The way the river underneath it all was not a background to the chanting, but the same kind of thing. Moving water and moving sound, both going somewhere. Something in him was at rest in a way that had nothing to do with having finished his work or resolved his questions or arrived at any conclusion. The first verse of the Dhammapada had been with him his whole life. The verse about the mind as the forerunner of all things. Mind leads. What the mind has decided, the day will follow. He had taught this verse. He had translated it. He had explained it to monks who were just beginning and to scholars who had been practicing for decades. And what he had found, in all those years of translating and explaining and preserving, was that the verse had something in it that no translation quite reached. The verse is not only about the mind as a cause, it is about the mind as a quality, a well-directed mind. The second verse says, brings happiness, not a corrected mind, not a fixed mind, a well-directed mind, which is different, which is more like a river that has found its natural channel, moving without effort toward the sea because the sea is where it goes. Not forced, not controlled, simply oriented. He had spent his life directing the mind toward what needed to be preserved. The language, the texts, the practice, the tradition that had held the Khmer people's understanding of themselves for 15 centuries and was under threat of being replaced by something shallower and more convenient, and lying in the last dark before morning, with the chanting coming through the wooden walls and the river going where it went, and the first pale light beginning to appear at the edge of the shutters. He felt, without drama and without announcement, that the direction had not always been his doing, that it had been simpler than the effort he had brought to it, that something in him had known all along which way the river ran, and all the translating and compiling and teaching had been, in some essential way, the mind following its own nature toward the thing it was oriented toward, the way a river follows the contours of the land, not through effort, but through being itself completely. The mind, which knows what it loves, and moves toward what it loves without resistance, is not a trained mind or an achieved mind. It is simply a mind that has stopped fighting its own nature. It is the well-directed mind the Dhammapada was speaking of, not directed from outside, not forced into a channel, but free to follow the direction it was already moving in before any instruction arrived. He rose before the chanting ended. He washed his face in the basin by the door, the water cool and slightly silty from the river, as it always was. He dressed. He walked down to the vihara and joined the monks for the last part of the morning service, sitting with the easy posture of a man who has sat this way for 50 years, his voice finding the familiar Pali syllables without hesitation, the sound of his voice and the other voices becoming a single sound in the hall and then being received by the walls and the air and the early morning quiet outside. The river continued outside, moving through the city that was still mostly asleep, carrying the water of 4 countries toward the sea without needing to understand why it was the river or where it was going or whether it was doing it correctly. The dictionary would not be finished for another 24 years. Chuan Nath would be 84 when it was finally published. He would die 2 years later at Wat Aunalam, and his ashes would be interred there, in the temple he had lived in for most of his adult life. And the monks who had chanted the morning service every dawn for decades would continue to chant it. And the Pali canon in Khmer would sit in the libraries of the monasteries across Cambodia. And the words he had spent his life preserving would be carried forward by people who would not know his name. This is the last door we open tonight. The verse from the Dhammapada that began our journey said that the mind is the forerunner of all things. The verse we return to now, at the close of this night, is the second half of what the Buddha said. The first verse is the warning. From a troubled mind, suffering follows. The second verse is the gift. From a well-directed mind, happiness follows one as a shadow that never departs. Not a silenced mind, not an empty mind, not a mind that has been forced into stillness by discipline or exhausted into quiet. A mind that is well directed, which is the mind that has found the thing it actually cares about and stopped fighting the fact that it cares about it. The mind that is moving, in this moment, in the direction of what it truly is. Tonight, after 8 doors, after 8 lives and 8 traditions and 8 different ways of pointing at the same thing, what the mind truly is has not changed and does not need to change. Bunkei, in the autumn hall at Ryamonji, said it was never born and never needs to be fixed. That the recognition is already here, as simple as knowing a crow's voice before you name it. Huyen Kwang found it in the plum blossoms that bloomed in the cold garden without being asked, in the bee that took what was offered and left the flower whole. Buddhaghosa helped a young monk see that the long night is only long when we are fighting it. That, the pattern named, is the pattern loosened. Neong sat with the question of what watch is, the question he had carried since his friend died at 20. Until one autumn morning, the question simply dissolved, and a leaf landed in the courtyard with the sound of something heard for the first time. Naropa recognized the gap between the map and the country the map described, and walked out of the greatest library in the world with nothing but the direction of his own longing. Mazu ate when he was hungry, and weeded the garden when it needed weeding, and the mind that did these things was already the way. Nothing to add, nothing to achieve. The ordinary mind, doing ordinary things. Pema Karpo wrote 24 volumes and then laid the brush across the inkstone and looked out at the winter ridge, and knew that the one word that brings peace is not a word at all, but the space between all words. And Chuon Nath, in a city under colonial rule, in a century that would bring Cambodia to the edge of Eurasia and beyond, lay on his mat before dawn and let the chanting come through the walls, and did not try to understand what he already knew. He let the river be the river. He let the mind be the mind. He let the morning be the morning. Let your breath be your breath now. Let the weight of your body be held by what is holding it, fully, without effort on your part. Let the sounds outside be part of the night, rather than interruptions in it. The small sounds, the distant sounds, let them be the texture of this hour, rather than things to attend to. Let whatever is circling in the mind circle without needing to stop. The circling will slow on its own, the way water slows when the wind that was moving it has passed. Without effort, simply by ceasing to be fed. You have come through 8 doors tonight. Every one of them opened onto the same room. The room that has no name, that has no doctrine, that is not located in Japan or Vietnam or Sri Lanka or Korea or Tibet or India or China or Bhutan or Cambodia. It is located here, in this body, in this particular dark, in this breath that is moving right now without any instruction from you. This room has always been here. This is what all 8 voices were pointing at. Not a destination. The place you started from. Sleep whenever you are ready. There is nothing more required of tonight. Or lie here for as long as you wish, in the company of these 8 voices from 8 centuries and 8 corners of the world, all of them pointing at exactly where you are right now. You do not need to drift off to have received what this night has offered. You do not need to remember any of it tomorrow. The river does not need to remember the rain that became it. The river continues. The mind that is well directed continues, moving where it goes without needing to explain itself to itself. The morning will come when it comes. The light will return when it returns. The city will wake around the river and the river will not notice. Until then, the dark is exactly what it is, not waiting to be something else, not on its way to morning. Simply this, the dark and your breath in it, and the weight of the night resting lightly over everything. That is enough. It has always been enough. This is what every door was pointing at. Let yourself go now, into whatever comes next, into the dark, into the breath, into the rest that has been waiting for you the whole time you were listening. Tonight, you have traveled to 8 places that most maps do not show. You sat in the autumn hall at Riamonji, while a man born into poverty and stubbornness stood before 10,000 farmers and said, "The mind you are afraid of is already free." You walked in the winter mountains of northern Vietnam with a poet monk who had been the top scholar of his empire and gave all of it away to follow the plum blossoms. You lay in the monsoon dark of Anuradhapura, while a scholar from across the sea named a pattern that keeps people awake, and gave that naming as medicine. You stood in the courtyard of a Korean monastery while a great master asked a brilliant student one question the student could not answer, and found in his inability to answer it the beginning of something real. You followed Naropa out of the most magnificent library in the world on the strength of a feeling he could not name. You sat in a Jiangxi kitchen eating rice with a master who said the mind that ate the rice was already the way. You watched the last winter light on a Tibetan ridge while an old man set down 24 volumes and looked at what was behind them. And you listened, in the pre-dawn dark of a city on a great river, to the sound of an ancient chant moving through wooden walls, while a man who had spent his life preserving things learned to hold them lightly enough to let them go. 8 traditions, 8 centuries, 8 different voices speaking from 8 different mountains and monasteries and riverbanks, all of them saying, in the particular language that their particular life had given them, the same thing, that the mind you have been carrying through this day was never the problem, that the rest you have been reaching for has always been here, underneath the reaching, that the direction the heart moves in when it stops being supervised is, more often than it has been told, the right one. I chose these 8 stories because each of them showed me something I needed to see at a time when I needed to see it. I hope they have offered you something of the same, whether you remember them clearly in the morning, or whether they dissolve into the dark the way all dreams do, leaving only a quality of light behind. If something you heard tonight stays with you, or if something surfaces unexpectedly over the next few days, the way certain things do, I am grateful. And if all 8 doors simply carried you into sleep, then they did exactly what they were here to do. If you found something tonight that was useful, please consider leaving it for someone else. A like, a comment, a share with one person you think might need this. That is all any of this requires. That things worth keeping keep moving, from hand to hand, the way rivers move. And if you listened all the way to this moment and sleep still has not arrived, let that be fine. The night has held you regardless. The 8 voices have kept you company in the dark, and that is enough. You are enough. May you wake tomorrow lighter than you were tonight. May whatever you are carrying find a place to rest. May the mind that led you here be, when you next open your eyes, as gently directed as a river that has found the sea. Good night. The Dhammapada has been teaching the wandering mind for 2,500 years. Tonight it taught through 8 doors. Tomorrow it will find another way to reach whoever needs it. The river continues. The teaching continues. And you, finally, rest.